Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare.
One time Prabhupada came to New Mayapur, and we also arrived late because we were doing traveling Sankirtan. Up to the last minute we were always doing our Sankirtan, so we arrived a little late, and Prabhupada was giving darshan on the lawn. And at the end Prabhupada asked for questions. So I thought, well, if I ask a question, my spiritual master will see me. He'll know that I'm his disciple, that I'm here. Because there were always so many devotees around, and we didn't get that much intimate association. So I raised my hand. I said, yes, Srila Prabhupada, I have a question. In your lecture, you were saying that the pure devotee of Krishna, he sees Krishna everywhere. Because of his love, he sees the Supreme Personality of Godhead everywhere. But in the Shikshastakam prayers, Lord Chaitanya is in the mood that he's feeling separation from Krishna. And thus he's feeling a moment to be like 12 years or more in separation. So how do we understand this? That on one hand the devotee is seeing the Lord everywhere, but he's also feeling separation. Prabhupada closed his eyes. I was just sitting very close to Prabhupada. He closed his eyes. You know, it's a deep subject, Vipralamba Bhav. Feeling loving sentiments for the Lord in separation. And then he opened his eyes, he leaned over and he said, this is a very difficult question, he said, for advanced devotees. He said, someday, when you're advanced, you will understand the answer to this question. That's all he said. But I felt like, you know, in the Chaitanya Charitamrita, there's the story of one devotee who Mahaprabhu was not pleased with them, Mukunda Datta, who he had been going to hear from some impersonalists. He was attending their meetings. And when Mahaprabhu heard this, he ostracized them. I will not see this devotee. But on the plea of the Vaishnavas, all right, I'll see him after 1 million births. So he started dancing and echoing, oh, Mahaprabhu's agreed to see me. And 1 million births. So when Prabhupada said that, one day when you're advanced, you will I thought, okay, by Prabhupada's mercy, one day I'll achieve some level of Krishna consciousness where I'll get the answer to that question. Devotee is a perfect gentleman, and I saw that Prabhupada, he was willing to preach to anyone and everyone. He always had time for anyone who came. He was the perfect listener, and he was always able to give the expert advice according to where that person was at in Krishna consciousness. And he was so expert that he could touch the heart of anyone who came, even if a person was antagonistic. I saw this in some, like one lecture, one darshan Prabhupada was giving in Paris, and he said, are there any questions? And one lady, she raised her hand, she said, Swamiji, what was I in my last life? And Prabhupada ignored the question. And then he took another question, and she stood up, Swamiji, I want you to answer my question. What was I in my last life? And then Prabhupada ignored again. And then third time she asked, and Prabhupada said, this is not a relevant question. Pariprashana sevaya. Questions of the spiritual master should be relevant. How to advance in Krishna consciousness. How to render service to Krishna. He said, it's not so important what you were in your last life, but what you'll be in your next life. That got her. She said, oh. So what I can be in my next life? And Prabhupada said, you can be devotee of Krishna if you chant Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare. So like that, the times that I had in Prabhupada's association, I would see whether it was an admiral or it was a boy who was, you know, a hippie boy, or whether it was a scholar, or whether it was just a mother of a devotee. Prabhupada was so expert that he could interest them somehow in Krishna consciousness. They would go away with a favorable impression of Krishna consciousness. So that, for me, that's like a perfect gentleman. He knew how to deal with people. Although Prabhupada could become angry. In a big Pandal program in Bombay, I wasn't there personally, but Giriraj Maharaj told me Prabhupada became very angry when one boy said that he was God. Krishna was not God, he was God. In front of 50,000 people, Prabhupada exploded. You are not God, you are a dog. He became angry. defending his beloved Krishna. And many people walked out of that Pandal program because they were thinking, what kind of sadhu is this? But this is sadhu. If one really loves Krishna and Krishna is blasphemed, then the devotee will stand up to defend his beloved. So Prabhupada knew how to react in every situation to give Krishna conscious instruction to that person.
When we were on a walk in Los Angeles, I told him that I was in charge of the Bhakti program at that time, and I told him that about some new devotees that had joined. One gentleman had joined at the age of 53, and he was a PhD and also a priest, a Christian priest. And so I told Srila Prabhupada that he had joined, and Prabhupada was very pleased, and he said, you must take very good care of him, give him special treatment, special care, make sure he's comfortable, everything like that.
One of the last times I saw him at the airport, this was actually when he was leaving and he was not arriving. So when he was leaving, he had to wait for a little while sitting in a chair and the devotees would sit around him very quietly, and we were just enjoying seeing Srila Prabhupada. So when we got there, before he got to sit down, the devotees were chanting, it was big kirtan, and actually then he did sit down. He did sit down, and he had all these big guns sitting around him. I believe it was Brahmananda and some other, bodyguards, and not letting anybody get too close. There was this one older woman. I'd say we were all very young, so she was old. She was probably in her late 50s, and she always seemed a little bit, maybe a little nutty. She would come to the temple almost every day, and she had a white uniform on. We didn't know what she was. We didn't know if she was a hairdresser or a nurse or whatever. She always had a white uniform on and her white shoes, and she would come by and maybe once a week just give some little drop of toilet paper, just drop off some little condiments, things like that. Maybe she got them for where she worked. And she was a bit of a character, and she was there at the airport. And she was within probably about 4 feet or so away, and I saw she was anxious. She was very anxious. She wanted to get closer to Prabhupada, and she couldn't see very good. And so I was in front, and I was watching, and Prabhupada points to her, and he tells the disciple to move out of the way, get out of the chair, and let her sit down. And it was so nice to see, Prabhupada setting an example to, give the seat to this woman. And that was very wonderful to see.
There was, in Mayapur, I was acting as one of his guards. We used to take turns guarding Prabhupada's room. Sometimes the guards got the opportunity to go in with guests and sit down. Once, this was interesting to me, one very old sadhu came to see Srila Prabhupada. Not very well dressed, very old and poorly dressed. And he came in, and I came in with him, and we sat down. And it was just Prabhupada and they spoke probably in Bengali. And I couldn't understand it. But then after some time, Prabhupada went and took some money and gave some rupees to the sadhu. And the sadhu thanked him and went out. So I don't know what they spoke, but that was interesting.
And then I remember one time in the airport, and it's in my mind, it was TWA, and Prabhupada was sitting by himself. And I was thinking, oh my God, how could Prabhupada be by himself? So I stood there, I was thinking, well, let me guard Prabhupada, I'm going to guard him, so a woman's going to guard him. And all the sannyasis, they were all huddled. I guess there was a problem with the tickets. And they were all in a big huddle, and I was looking and I was thinking, why isn't anybody here? So I kind of stayed by Prabhupada, and he was so cute, he knew what, that I was, and he was saying, don't worry, I'm fine, don't worry. But I stayed close, and in a way I was doing Sankirtan too, because I was preaching to the people who were on that flight, and I was telling them how fortunate they were with pure devotee, and I was handing out back to Godheads, And I could see Prabhupada was very pleased that I was doing this little, just a tiny little service, but, you know, I just felt so happy to just do anything for Prabhupada. And he was so appreciative.
Once we came to see Srila Prabhupada in Hyderabad, after we'd been touring along the east coast of India. So Prabhupada called us into his room, and he was asking us how many sets of books we distributed, what did the professors think about the books. Then he told us that you should keep your health very good on traveling Sankirtan, and it's best if you don't eat any grains. Better just to eat vegetables and fruits, take milk products, and also nuts. And then he made a sign like that, cashew nuts. Every day like Ekadashi. In this way you can keep your health very strong.
We were doing Harinam. Prabhupada was still at the temple. We had organized a Harinam party with quite a large party. About 15 or 18 devotees. And there happened to be a big parade that day around through the downtown. So we were chanting, not in the parade, but through the crowds, and it was a very nice atmosphere. It was great. We had chanted so many times in Portland, and but suddenly, what seemed for no reason, the police came, and they just arrested us all and put us into vans and took us to jail. This had never been, we had never had that experience before. So we were in jail, and they said the bail is $50 per person if you want to get out. It was a Saturday. And the problem was that you know, the court wouldn't be seen until Monday. We couldn't be, our hearing wasn't, we weren't to be tried till Monday, so we would have to stay in jail till Monday unless we had $50 apiece to get out. Unfortunately, the temple had no money at that time, so we were stuck. And I was very sad, especially because I was supposed to organize all the programs for Srila Prabhupada there. So we were in a few hours, and then someone, the warden came and said to me, "Are you such and such?" And I said yes, and he said, "Okay, so you're bailed out." So I was bailed out, and then I was told that Srila Prabhupada gave the money to bail me out. And then when I got back to the temple, he called for me, and I went in to see him. And he said, we had to save at least one. And it was very touching for me. And then he asked about the situation. He said, "So, what happened?" I said, "Well, we were chanting, and they arrested us." And he said, "Yes, Lord Chaitanya also had problems with the Kazi, with the kirtan." He said, "But if they object to the mridangas and the kartals," he said, "you don't have to play the instruments. You can just clap your hands and chant Hare Krishna, like that." So that was another instruction about chanting.
And one time, it was whenever he was in the room, we were all happy. We could do anything. We were superhuman. We were in Vaikuntha. And one time in a class, he said, "So, if you chant one chapter of Bhagavatam in Sanskrit every day for 1 year, at the end of 1 year, you will all be Sanskrit scholars. You can do this?" "Yes, Srila Prabhupada, Jai Srila Prabhupada." "All right, you will do this?" "Yes, Srila Prabhupada, Jai Prabhupada." "Okay, you will do," I think 3 times he said, you do this now. And we all said, "Yes." I've never met one person who's done this. But when he said to do it, it seemed really easy. One time, about 2 years later, I did it for 6 months. So maybe I'm half a Sanskrit scholar.
Once I went into Prabhupada's room, and he was sitting in the corner with his head in his hand like this, and he just sat there for a few minutes with a pained expression on his face, and then he looked up at me and he said, "This Bombay project is such a headache, it's such a headache." Then he paused, and then he said, "But it is for Krishna, so it is all right."
But Prabhupada has done so much labor
without food. He taught everything, how to cook, how to clean, how to make a garland, how to prepare all the prasad, how to decorate, everything. And about books, this sort of printing and the photos, it is his invention. Even the Christian missionaries, they were advanced in book distribution, but now they have failed. He has in such a way, he has developed his book department, and it is his ideas acted. In Bhagavatam, all photos, different varieties of photos he has written. Even nobody, it is a new thing. You don't find photos of different types. Yes, adopted. It was his suggestion. And he gave more importance to books. That is why he says only books. Even our Prabhupada said, you should print books. Only small books. But Europeans, Westerners, they are not satisfied. They are not pleased seeing a small book. Only big volumes with title page and all cover page must be dazzling. So yes, now you see, we have seen every householder has one set of Bhagavata and one set of Chantamata. He had never seen even open the book. But they preserve it on the table, preserve it. And he has done this. He has invented it. Nowhere you find such book distribution. It is not, now the institution is maintained by book distribution. In India, people, they are subscribing for this, some 10,000
life member.
Life members. In Europe, no life members. England, America, no life members. Only books. They sell books, free. So that is how he has invented this. But his blessings, he never wants that the institution with hard labor he has established will be ruined. He never wants. But the institution is there, that it should not be commercialized. The spiritual strength must be there. Krishna consciousness should be there. That is why we must appeal, that's all. We are nothing, we are not going to accuse anybody. Of course, when a great Acharya comes and goes away, naturally, in every sampradaya, it is the case, always. And now Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Goswami Prabhupada, he has introduced many new things in the society. But after his demise, it also shattered. And Swami Maharaj also has done this by hard labor. And after his demise, now the problem is, there should be at least a unity among the Vaishnavas. As our Maharaj says, at least unity. Because if he is different, what harm is there to talk and freely use the words? What harm is that? No harm. But Pratihingsa tyaji anya karavi palam. We should not have the retaliation tendency. You must always have that all to live and let others live. Now it is very difficult to unite. Nobody, Kali Yuga, this is Kali Yuga. Everybody is independent. Even a disciple is independent and Guru is independent. And Guru cannot claim that I have got so many disciples, because disciples are independent. The disciple is one who surrenders. Tadvidhi pranipatena pariprasnena sevaya upadekshyanti te jnanam jnanina tattvadarishana. Unless they surrender, they cannot teach and they cannot learn. Not only here in colleges, universities, no surrender. The same is in religious institutions also. If you force them, they will go away. And you cannot maintain the institution, so you have to obey them. It is the case, very bad. The more you are increasing the number of disciples or number of institutions, the burden is upon you only. The main person should carry the whole burden to accommodate the public and dealings with the public, and now the finance position also should be reformed. All this in Kali Yuga very difficult to change others. Tadvidhi pranipata, no pranipata, no pariprasna, no seva, nothing seva. It cannot be realized. Now our aim should be at least to do our individual bhajan and should not destroy the channel and preserve as far as we can preserve the channel. No further pressure can be given. Nobody will listen to you. Nobody. I have no disciples. Prabhupada said, I have got 4 disciples. 2 legs, 2 hands. 4 disciples. No disciples. Though he has disciples, he never think that. So he introduced Prabhu. Prabhu. One should call another brahmachari, his god brother, Prabhu. That Prabhu means master. I am his servant. So he also even called his disciples, he used to call Prabhu. Prabhupada used to call Prabhu. Bhakti Vijay Prabhu, he says. Not Bhakti Vijay. He says Bhakti Vijay Prabhu. Or this secretary, Kunja Bihari, Vidyabhushan Prabhu, he says. Sundarananda Prabhu, Vasudeva Prabhu, he used to call them. He has introduced this. Nobody knows this. No institution they have adopted this, that one disciple should call his another disciple, not this a naked name, but name Prabhu must be added.
many qualities. ତାଙ୍କର କ୍ୱାଲିଟି ବିଷୟରେ କହିବୁ ତାଙ୍କର କ୍ୱାଲିଟି ବିଷୟରେ
କାହାର
ସାଇମାନ
it's very difficult to speak about the quality of a Vaishnava unless the Vaishnava blesses one. He cannot speak. But find the Vaishnava, even the Devata Chinitanare Vaishnava.
Devare Chinitanare Vaishnava.
All devatas, all the demigods could not be able to understand about a Vaishnava. So how can you say anything? And whatever the qualities he had, all devotional qualities he possessed. And that we can know him, that he is great only by preaching. That in 10 years, there is no history, no record in anywhere. Preaching in 10 years, he has established this divine name everywhere, as it is told in Mahaprabhu's future. Mahaprabhu said in Sarvatra Pachara Huive Mor Naam, Prithvi Te Athe Jota Nagara Vikram. So everywhere was. Now you see everywhere Harinam. Though Maharaj went away 20 years already, but you see now everywhere parties, there may be parties, but they do the same nama. If the number of parties increase, no loss. If they maintain the rules, moral and spiritual rules, that will help. If not, there will be Kortabhadra, Aulu, Bauru, Kortabhadra, Nera, Dorabeso, Science, Adhyas, Martha, Jat Gosai. There are the 13 Apasampradayas. Bhaktivinoda Thakur wrote. Now, if they don't follow, then it will be number will be doubled. That's all. And this happens. None can able to start. Now people are only we should have an aim that calm or prema. What is calm? Self-satisfaction. What is prema? Krishna satisfaction. So if our attention, if our desires, and if all our activities aim at Krishna's, that is, Rupa Goswami says, Anukulya Sankalpa Pratikulya Vivarjana. We must accept what is favorable to devotion. If all the devotees, all the sampradayas, all the institutions should have a common aim, that devotion should be there. And whatever favorable to devotion, they should try to accept it. And whatever not favorable, unfavorable, they must give it up. That is wanted. Now nobody can teach you. Prabhupada has created an institution where no other institution can teach you, because he made you scholars, because from top to bottom you could know everything. All the translations and all the writers, everything is what translated, everything. No other people can able to talk to you. But now we must think how far we are advanced towards the purity of devotion, that we must try to.
May I ask a
Hare Krishna. Many thanks to you that we offer.
ପ୍ରଭୁ ତାଙ୍କର ତାର ଝିଅ ଗୋଟେ ଅଛି
Eh?
11 ବର୍ଷ ଝିଅ ଅଛି ସେ ପ୍ରଭୁପାଦଙ୍କଠୁ ଦୀକ୍ଷା ନେଇପାରିବ କି ସେ ଫଟୋ ରଖିକି ବୋଲି ପଚାରୁଛି
Jyot.
ହଁ
Hodam means
ନେଇନି ସେ ପ୍ରଭୁପାଦଙ୍କଠୁ ନେଇପାରିବ କି
obey.
ହଁ ପ୍ରଭୁପାଦଙ୍କୁ ଗୁରୁ ଭାବିକିରି ସେ ସେମିତି କରିପାରିବ କି
Anybody should take the living gurus. No guru already passed. How can you take Harinam? You will touch the photo of that and take Harinam. You can take, but it is not the process. It is not the process. And now it is a difficult question. As one Prabhupada has given Harinama, he has not given Diksha. And to such person, Diksha is not necessary. As Prabhupada in Shastra quotation says, no Diksham, no Purassarjam, Manakekshati. No Purassarana, no Diksha functioning is necessary. It was Haridas, only Naam. Importance to Naam is. But the institution requires that one must approach a living sadhu, and take his advice. And he must give Diksha as well as Siksha. And if he finds anything more, want to know more, he can take Siksha from number of gurus. But Diksha Guru must be one. That is our Shastra quotation.
ଚିଠିରେ ଆପଣ ଲେଖିଥିଲେ ଜଗନ୍ନାଥଙ୍କ ମନ୍ଦିରକୁ ଯିବା ପାଇଁ ତାଙ୍କୁ ଆପଣ ଚିଠି
Yes, Prabhupada told me, and you please try, because Vishwanath Das was our friend, and he took us to his village, and there for 7 days we were there, and he said, you please talk and see that my devotees are allowed to have. But there,
about Puri Jagannath temple to enter the disciple.
he was chief minister, Vishwanath Das. He comes from Brahmins community, and he was very, very religious minded. And he has no power, because this religious Puri, according to they have got their code. They should follow that code only till now. How the dress will be, what are the offerings will be, everything is according to code they follow. There is that Sabha. Ki Sabha Sita?
Mukti Mandapa Sabha.
Mukti Mandap Sabha. All the old people, they sit there. And they can change, but they also cannot change. Because in our code, Mandala Panji, they will code. So I went and gave me one Krishna book. I met Vishwanath Das, I gave him, and I said, you please take initiation to see that some change can be adopted there. But he is not a strong chief minister. I said, I will try. And after that the ministry has gone, he died.
Prabhupada is written in letter to Maharaj to try to enter disciples in Puri temple. Maharaj saying that.
And now here all the Europeans, they can mix with Indians, especially in Italian people. They mix. If they remain in India and learn some local language, and they are just like Indians. And why now so many people go, enter into the temple and have darshan? Nobody checks them. Nobody. And he also can go and say no harm. They are not so much rigid, follow rigidity. All the police people are there. Many people go. And in the time of Ratha Jatra, they climb the Ratha and become Ratha. Not here when the Ratha is here near the temple. On the way, in the night, nobody will be there. And if they go, just to pay 10 rupees. They climb and go. No district. And for other Europeans, those who are devotees, naturally they also have something, some devotion. Jagannath knows that, so they are allowed. He is also, you are also a disciple of Prabhupada.
Yes.
You are having this Tripundra.
त्रिपुंड नहीं, राधे राधे श्याम नाम.
Radhe Radhe.
Hare Krishna.
All the Advaitavadis, they are all.
Tripunda, 3 lines.
Oh, I see.
This is called Tripundra. And Vaishnava says, if you see Tripundra, not Urdhapundra, Tripundra, you must go subtly and take a bath. I mean, with the glass you must take a bath. That the restrictions are there. Of course, the Advaitavadis, they never think. But Vaishnavas then cannot tolerate it. They say, we never allow you. Go. Hari Bol, Hari Bol, Hari Bol. If Prabhupada cannot live long, how can he give Harinam? And Sampradaya must be there. It is not Christianity, as you say, Father is one. And who is that? Jesus Christ. So whoever gives it is Jesus Christ. But actually this is called Mayavada. This is Mayavada. That they say, and some of the people here also, in Bangalore, they say Prabhupada, there is none equal to Prabhupada. What if you are not fit to have the association of Prabhupada, then you are not born or but young. Now when you come, you cannot say that Prabhupada only my Guru, nobody else. No. You must have the patience, because Prabhupada cannot survive for 100 years or 200 years. And all the people, those who are not born, they will be born after 100 years. And what should they do? They cannot say that Prabhupada only must give Harinam. We cannot. Only selected sadhus with good qualities must accept. Then, if so, you should born in the time of Prabhupada, so that you will get chance. And those who were born in the time of Prabhupada could not avail the chance, their misfortune. And this Chaitanya Bhagavat author says, why this stupid life has come after 50 years he was born. Mahaprabhu's disappeared 50 years he was born. Now he says,
Vrindavan Das Thakur.
Vrindavan Das Thakur says, why this stupid life has come now? It is only a burden I carry. Carry. Yes. And that sort of feeling also will take him nearer to the Lord. Keno mathai pran es kisu ko lagiya. Narottam Das keno nagal mariya. Why is Narottama is surviving? You could not born then and you should die. Let me die. That feeling also bring nearer to the Lord. That feeling now also that feeling is wanted. Wanted. Raghunath Goswami says, Sunyayate Mahagostam Girindro Jagarayate Jagratundayate Kundam Jivato Rahitasame. I have no life. My life Rupa Goswami had gone. Raghunath Goswami is surviving. He says, why you are surviving? Why? Yes, your construction is stronger than the steel. It is why death doesn't come to this body. If death comes, who will resist? Who will resist this separation difficulties? Who will resist? Unless this body is steel like hard, so my heart is no death will come to it. Because if death comes, there is no need of suffering. But when there is life, so without death I must suffer. So God has given me that body is so strong body that no death comes early. They are also weeping. You go, oh now at 11 Koitrapara. Dibagu.
বেশি কিছু বড় ইয়ে নাই তা
বড় ଆଉ କ'ଣ
ସେ ହରିନାମ କୀର୍ତ୍ତନ କରୁଛନ୍ତି
ଏବେ
ହଁ ତାଙ୍କର ଅହରାତ୍ର
ହରେ କୃଷ୍ଣ
ଗୁରୁ ସବୁ ଫେଲ୍ ଡାଉନ୍ ହେଇଯାଉଛନ୍ତି ସେ ବିଷୟରେ
because everything depends upon the blessings of Guru and Sadhu. If the blessings of a Sadhu and a Guru, one can reach and one can be in the path. Lack of Sadhu's blessings and Guru's blessing, one man may be more intelligent and more philosopher, great philosopher, but with all good qualities, he cannot stand. It is nayamatma pravasanena labhya na medhaya na bahuna srutena jamai vaisya brunute. One must surrender. If one surrendered to Lord, surrendered to the Guru, surrendered to the Vaishnavas, surrendered to all, because his conception is all this world belongs to the Lord. All the creatures, Pranavet Dandavat Bhumo, Aswa Chandala Gokhala, he must offer his Satanga Pranam even to a ass, a dog, a cat, a dog eater. Actually not the form of the dog, but the Lord who is pervading, all pervading is there. So one must be humble always like that. Unless there may be 1 out of 1 million sadhu. Sadhus are not gems, they are gems. They are lying deep in the unfathomed ocean. And these gems are not floating on the side of the road, you can get gems.
And he said, he asked me, go and see how heavy the deity is. So I went over, and Shamsuna went over, and I tilted Radharani, and I said, not very heavy. And she was heavy, but I said, not very heavy. Shamsuna had Krishna. Prabhupada said, all right, we'll take them now. He said, pick them up, and and then the man said, wait, Swamiji, wait a moment. And I think maybe he had an idea of recovering some of the cost. I don't know what he had an idea. He said, wait. And he said, no, there's no problem. It's not heavy. These are American boys. They're very strong. And we carried the deities out, and the man was just protesting, Swamiji, went 1 minute, and we walked right out to the van and brought Radha Krishna, put them in, and Prabhupada sat down in the seat next to the driver's seat, and he said, I'll take care of the deities, we'll be in touch with you. And the man just, the whole family was out there, and they were just like this, and Prabhupada said, okay, let's drive. So we drove off, and when we got around the corner, Prabhupada said, stop the car. And then we stopped the van, and Prabhupada said, take the cloth off the deities. We took the deities, and Prabhupada just started to offer prayers. There were tears in his eyes, and he started to sing the prayers from Brahma Samhita. And he said, Krishna has now appeared in London.
And Prabhupada, I talked the Pujari of Govindaji's temple, I talked him into giving Prabhupada a house on the temple grounds. So we cleaned this house, and Prabhupada came in, and he was very, very pleased. And one day, while this panda was going on, I went into Prabhupada. This is a sweet story, because I said, Prabhupada, it's kite flying season. There's kites in the sky. The sky is just covered with kites. And he said, are you going to go fly kites today? I said, no, I wasn't thinking of it. And he goes, I used to fly kites when I was young with my sister. And he said, and her kite would always fly higher than mine. And he said it would make me so angry because my sister's kite was always going to fly higher than mine. So he said, one day I decided I would cheat. And I got up on the roof and I started flying my kite from there. So my kite was flying higher than my sister's, Pishima. And then he says, but then she started chanting, Govinda, Govinda, help me. And her kite flew higher than mine. He said, so even in our childhood, we were always remembering Krishna. It was very sweet. Then he said, so you go fly kites today.
Pishima was adored and even worshipped, especially by the lady devotees. One time we were going in procession from Calcutta to Mayapur, and Pishima was in one of the rear cars. And then she got out, and all the women rushed there, and they were doing. And Prabhupada said, "What are they doing?" I said, "Well, Srila Prabhupada, they have respect for her, as they do, in a way, for you." He said, "Why? What is that? What has she ever done? She's just an old lady. What has she ever done?"
And when he first arrived, I showed him the flyers that I had made up for the Pandal ceremony. And it said, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami is going to be at so-and-so Mandir Govinda, because the Pandal itself was behind Govindaji's temple, and in the back of the temple in an open lot area. And it said, Bhaktivedanta Swami and his foreign disciples. Prabhupada looked at the foreign disciples. He said, "Why did you say foreign disciples?" I said, "I thought it would be attracting people." And he goes, "No, it should say American and European disciples. That is the attraction." And then he made one of the men redo the whole thing. And then he said, "What can I expect? You're just an unintelligent woman." I walked out. I was crying. I was so upset because I'd worked so hard to put this thing together. Then I found out that Prabhupada said after I left, he said, "I am very pleased with her, but a guru's business is to discipline. If I don't discipline, how will you ever learn?" He said, "Disciple means discipline, so therefore I discipline." He was actually not mad at me. It was very nice.
I had a habit, whenever Prabhupada would tell me something, I would always say, just unconsciously, I know. And one day Prabhupada said, you know, you think you know everything. And I really, it's like that, you think you know everything. Another time, Prabhupada had this system when he did his construction projects in India. 2 signers on every check. Prabhupada was one signer and I was the other. There was only one problem when Prabhupada would travel out of the country. So one day I suggested to Prabhupada, why don't you sign some blank checks? Prabhupada did not like that idea at all. He said, this is my account. Is it all right that I decide how the money will be used? Is that all right with you? You know, I was suggesting to him that we could do different things.
Dropping back a little bit to one of the cities we were in, and I believe it was in Indore. There was an invitation one night from the Indore Lions Club, I believe it was. They had clubs like they have in the West, the Lions Club. These were local politico businessmen, and they invited us to come for a program. Prabhupada didn't want to go do it, so he called me in. He said, "I'm not going to go to this one." He said, "I do not like these men." He said, "They are snakes." You go and give the lecture. I went, "Oh my gosh," you know. And I said, "Well, what should I tell them?" Right? He said, "Just tell them we are spreading their Hindu religion all over the world, so they're obliged to give us a donation. But before you talk, have a big kirtan, right? Have a good kirtan. You lead it, right? And then you speak, right?" He said, "If you have a big kirtan first," he said, "the chanting," he said, it is our mantra for charming snakes. Then they'll be able to listen for a few minutes without arguing and try to get them to agree to give a donation and go." So he said that it is our mantra for charming snakes.
When you came in as president, you didn't feel like you were part of the material world. You felt that you were in some kind of a spiritual, transcendental environment. I didn't know about Vrindavan then, but now we'd say that Prabhupada actually was bringing Vrindavan with him. And so you felt the mood of Vrindavan whenever you came in the presence of Prabhupada. He was actually carrying Krishna in his heart. So I didn't understand that, but I felt that. Just being with Srila Prabhupada, I could feel the change. I could see that here was a genuine spiritual master that was actually practicing what he was preaching, or practicing what he was teaching. The other people that I visited, they had books and they had teachings, but then they didn't practice those things, where Prabhupada was. So all these things helped to build up my faith, but then Prabhupada was very merciful, and he immediately engaged me in service. He had me be an assistant to, at that time his secretary was Govinda Dasi, I think Gorsundar, I forget, I think it was Gorsundar, I'm not sure, I can't remember, I think. And so when they would go shopping, when Prabhupada took the afternoon nap, and they would have me like, they call it babysit, a guru sit. I had to sit outside just in case Prabhupada woke up and wanted something, then I would be on call. And usually he didn't want anything, but I would be there while they were out just at that time. So sometimes Prabhupada would wake up and he'd call me in, and then he would ask me different things. He said he wanted to get a flower. This was he said that if I get a flower every day, this will improve my this will increase my longevity. So he asked me, "Can you bring me a flower, a rose, especially a rose, not just a flower, I wanted a rose." And then I was very excited, here the spiritual master was asking me to bring him a rose every day. So I said yes. So I went back to the temple and then told the temple president I was going to get a rose for Srila Prabhupada. And the president said, "What are you doing? You're in Maya. You can't do that." I said, "Why? Prabhupada told me to get him a rose." And I had phoned up, he heard me phone up a florist and order, I was going to go and pick up a rose. And he got really angry that, I shouldn't do that. But I thought he was like imposing himself, that I'll do everything else you say, but this one thing, Prabhupada asked me to bring him a rose. I want to bring him the rose. He got very angry and said I couldn't do that, I should do something else. So I became a little angry because he was yelling at me, and it was so anyway. I kind of just left the temple with the vibrations ringing in my ear, and I was walking off, and I got to like a dead end where the road it didn't go any further, and nearby I saw there was a florist shop, and that whole time I would just, I wasn't able to think. So I walked in the florist shop. I thought, well, I'll get a rose, and the person said, oh, here, I've been waiting for you. Here's the rose. Turned out it was the exact shop that I'd called, but I'd forgotten the address and everything. So then I went back and I saw Prabhupada and bowed down, and I offered him the rose, and he took it. So thank you very much.
One thing that really struck me is one of the first letters Srila Prabhupada ever sent me was when he was in India. And I had that tremendous desire to take care of him when he came back. For those 3 weeks had really changed my life. Spending 3 weeks with him after he got out of the hospital, I really wanted to continue serving him in that way. And so the whole 6 months he was in India, I was praying to Lord Jagannath every day that if he comes back, please let me be his servant, please let me cook for him, please let me clean his room, let me do anything, just let me be near him, let me serve him and be near him. This was my very strong desire. And so I got a letter from him, and in the letter, the last statement was, I know your mind. Just, I know your mind.
Also with that building in Detroit, when Prabhupada, this is Deva Siddham Mandir, when Prabhupada walked through, he had no money at the time, for this particular project. He had no money. And it was a gorgeous, gorgeous building. In fact, we didn't know what to do with it. There was a painting in the front lobby of all these naked women bathing. So all the sannyasis, they were all, everyone trying to be proper about things. Prabhupada looked at it, turned to the men and said, very nicely done. Then they came to where there was a big polar bear rug, the kind with the head and the teeth and everything. So Srila Prabhupada looked at it and very gingerly took his cane, put the tip of his cane in the mouth and lifted up and looked at the teeth. And very wide-eyed like a child, he turned to Jagadish Maharaj and said, they eat men? And Jagadish Maharaj said, sometimes, Srila Prabhupada. So Prabhupada put it down and made a wide berth as he walked around the rug, and it was just very sublime. Prabhupada said at one point, the man was asking, I think, $1 million something, or close to $1 million. Prabhupada said, every room is worth $1 million. In fact, it was even designed, there were 3 arches. They used to have the ballroom dancing, and they had where the orchestra was. There was 2 small arches and a large arch, just like we do for Jagannath, Radhakrishna, and Gaura Nitai. And even there were carved peacocks, there were lotuses, everything was carved, everything was designed. Prabhupada said, actually, this rich man, Krishna engaged him in building this building for us, and has simply been lying, waiting for us to come pick it up. So Prabhupada was had a vision for the building. So he walked through the whole thing, just like he could pull the money out of his bead bag. Just, price wasn't even an issue, and Prabhupada was talking about this and that. So finally outside there's a sunken garden, and they were sitting in the grotto area, their nice sun, everything was very peaceful. And the man was a very greedy man. He was like a real money grubber guy. Okay? You could see the grease on his fingers, practically speaking. So when he sat down, and here was Srila Prabhupada, loved the building, and Prabhupada's sublime aristocratic nature, that Prabhupada could just write the check. So Prabhupada said, this building is perfect for our purposes. Every room is exquisite, it's exactly what we want. He said, very aristocratic building. So the man was like, could taste the money. And Prabhupada turned to him and said, but we are not aristocrats. He said, we are professional beggars. Therefore, you should give it to us. And I thought the man was going to have a cardiac arrest, at the point. He was like, ah. So Prabhupada actually toyed with him. There's a whole story how Prabhupada toyed with him back and forth. And ultimately, Prabhupada got the building. The man actually tried to cheat us. After we got it, Ambarish gave half the money, I think, and then Lekha Shavanti, Lisa Ruther, gave half the money. And this way Prabhupada was able to, although he had nothing outside of his desire, and Krishna arranged the building and Prabhupada picked it up. And no one could believe the price Prabhupada got for it. In fact, the man, we got a call from a neighbor that after the papers were signed, that the man was stripping the building. He was taking all the mirrors off the walls, all the doorknobs, all the fixtures, all the light, because everything was very opulent. He was stripping whatever he could. So we actually went and stopped him. He had one truck there. And we said, how can you do this? He said, I can't help it. He said, your Swami cheated me. So they told Prabhupada the story later on. That's one of the times Prabhupada said, yes. Prabhupada said, I am a Calcutta boy. So he'd met his match with Srila Prabhupada.
I remember one time he was giving a lecture, and he was the whole lecture saying how we had to be 10% Krishna conscious. We had to be completely surrendered to Krishna, 100%. And he was just ramming that point home. And at the end of the class, the devotees were kind of, very serious and looking down, as if he could read their minds. That 100%, who could come up to that standard? So then he looked at them, and now he kind of relaxed his mood a little bit, and he said, well, if you can be 90% Krishna conscious, then you can also go back to Godhead. And then he started to slightly turn to prepare. There was a very big Vyasa-san, and he was very high up. It was maybe 4 feet in the air. It was so he had to go down steps to get down the Vyasa-san. So he was just starting to turn, and then he said, even 80%. Even if you're 80% surrendered, Krishna will still take you. So then he turned, and he got down the Vyasa-san, and he was walking away, and his chadar, his robe, the chadar was flowing with one hand, and then it was dragging on the ground, and he just kind of stopped at the devotees, looked at the devotees, and then he said, even if you're 70% Krishna conscious, still Krishna will take you in it. He threw the chadar over his shoulder and walked off with his head very high in the air.
In December of 1969, Srila Prabhupada again came to Boston, and I was there. I think the press must have been there at that time. And Srila Prabhupada was staying in a little house quite a long distance from the temple, off in a suburb someplace. And there was a lot of snow, and we had to go through these winding roads, and finally came to Prabhupada's house. Prabhupada was not in very good health. The winter was not agreeing with him. He had quite a serious cold. But he called us to his house. Hayagriva, Pradumna, Kirtanananda Maharaj was there, Satsvarup Maharaj came, I came. Basically the people who were involved with BTG. And Srila Prabhupada called a meeting. Prabhupada, just at that time, he was teaching us how to have meetings. Until then we were just doing things. Now Prabhupada taught us how to have a meeting. And he began by having kirtan, and then there was some discussion. And Prabhupada several times repeated that pattern in different venues, that this is how you have a meeting. You have kirtan and then you discuss. And Prabhupada was training us. So Prabhupada began explaining what should be the editorial policy for BTG. At that time, Hayagriva and Satsvarup Maharaj were the co-editors. And Prabhupada explained that there are 4 levels of Krishna consciousness, or 4 levels that should be addressed. First level is how to awaken someone, how to awaken him to Krishna consciousness. People are sleeping in illusion, in Maya, so we have to awaken them. That's the first stage. Then the second stage is how to train them. How to train them to be Krishna conscious. Someone comes forward, Swamiji, please accept me, please initiate me. So the second stage is training. Then the third stage is understanding Krishna's different energies. Radha Krishna Leela is on that stage. And the fourth stage, Prabhupada said, is Paramhansa stage. Always absorbed in thinking of Krishna. And that way, Prabhupada said. So he said this back to Godhead should be on the first 2 stages. How to awaken someone and how to train someone. Radha Krishna and those kind of subject matters, they're not meant for the general public. How to awaken someone and how to train him. These are the subject matters.
either Pradyumna or Kirtananda Maharaj, asked if we could print Brahma Samhita, whether we could print Brahma Samhita in Back to Godhead. And Prabhupada was not very much in favor of it because it was very dense. Prabhupada then he said, in small installments. He said, in small installments. He said, it will puzzle their brains. He said, my spiritual master used to speak from the highest elevated platform. And when he spoke it, he said it in such a way that somehow the room was just filled with effulgence as Prabhupada was speaking, or it seemed to me that the room was just filled with effulgence. And the way he spoke about his spiritual master, that he used to speak from the highest. I could just picture practically a throne so many feet up and his spiritual master speaking. Prabhupada just spoke with such regard for his spiritual master. Then Prabhupada began telling the whole story of how he'd met his spiritual master, how he'd been dragged by his friend Narendra Malik, and one thing led to another thing, and Prabhupada came. And Prabhupada explained that he said, even when he would speak in, Prabhupada said he used to speak from the highest elevated platform. He said, even when he would speak in Bengali, I could not understand. He said, but I would go on hearing. That was my policy. And my spiritual master noticed that this boy likes to hear. He said, I would understand or not understand, but I would go on hearing. And because I was enthusiastic about hearing, now I'm in Shravanam, now I'm enthusiastic about preaching, Kirtana. Because I was enthusiastic about hearing, now I'm enthusiastic about preaching. In 1969, we were at ISKCON Press in Boston. We were working on second canto and other work. And Srila Prabhupada was out in San Francisco. The Rath Yatra was coming up, and some devotees got the idea that the whole group of us, all the press workers, could pile in a van, drive across the country in 2 days, be there with Srila Prabhupada for the Rath Yatra, then turn around and come back and be back in Boston and keep going. So somehow it came to Srila Prabhupada's attention, and Prabhupada said, what do they want to come out here for? They should go on with their work, their prescribed duties. So from that we understood that association with the spiritual master is not just by physical proximity, but it's by our devotional service. Not being with him just on the scene, but being with him by serving him. It was also around that time, 1969, that it became important to identify Srila Prabhupada as founder Acharya of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. At first it was just A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami, then A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, then founder Acharya of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. That began while we were working on second canto. We were publishing it chapter by chapter in booklets. And we got the message from the West Coast that we were supposed to do this, but somehow the message got garbled, so we only had founder of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. And then Prabhupada was unhappy, he was upset with us. So then again the message came back, and so we ran it through the press again, running a black line through that founder line and doing it again, Acharya of the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. So again, of course, it was wrong. Finally we got it right, founder Acharya. And since then, of course, that's been there. Prabhupada was very particular about that. He foresaw that it would be important that the position of the founder Acharya of the society, specifically that his position as founder Acharya, should be well established. I remember when Srila Prabhupada later came to Los Angeles when the press was in LA, he passed by the BBT building, our newly occupied BBT building, and saw the Bhaktivedanta Book Trust. And underneath it, it didn't say founder Acharya, Srila Prabhupada. And Radha Vallabha, who was in charge of things in those days, got it got blasted by Srila Prabhupada. Even though he had the letters in a box, they were ready to go, they just hadn't been put up yet, but Srila Prabhupada chewed him out anyway. That, why is this missing? Prabhupada considered it very crucial. He issued a letter, in fact, at one point, to all the centers, that on all the letterhead, on all the cards, all the publications of the society, this line had to be there, Founder Acharya, His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. Prabhupada foresaw how significant it would be, how important it would be for us and for others to understand the society properly with its founder Acharya. In New York, in perhaps 1974, Srila Prabhupada came to Brooklyn. At that time the press was there. And Srila Prabhupada called me in one day to his quarters. And I remember he was sitting on a platform, he had a freshly shaved head, and he was sitting very regally and aristocratically. And he asked me concerning the manager of the press at that time, Advaita Das. Yes, I heard that Advaita is not attending the programs. Advaita and perhaps Uddhava, who was his colleague. I've heard that Advaita is not attending the programs. Is that a fact? Well, of course, I didn't want to be a tattletale, but I said, well, Srila Prabhupada, I admitted that that was probably so. Prabhupada said, go over there and tell them to close the press. We do not need this press. If they cannot come to the programs, better to close the press. And up to that time, Prabhupada had been putting tremendous emphasis on the importance of our press activities. He was giving money for it, he was emphasizing it. Devotees were working very hard on the press activities. And Prabhupada told me, go over there and tell them, we do not need this press, better to close the press. Prabhupada considered it very important that we keep up our standard activities of sadhana, our standard devotional activities. And better to close the press.
So at that time, Prabhupada got out of the car and Upananda came out, running out of the temple, and paid his obeisances, and Prabhupada patted Upananda on the head very affectionately. And we were having a kirtan. Actually, I was getting out the car. There was a group of devotees having a kirtan on the sidewalk. The front door of the temple had blown closed. So Prabhupada reached to open the front door of the temple and it was locked from the inside. At that time, my mother and father, I'd invited them. Apparently, there was some mix-up in the recollections, but I think before we went to the airport, there must have been some prior notification that Prabhupada was coming, but I think it was rather muddled. But I think at least we'd had the opportunity to invite some press to the temple. And somehow or other I'd also invited my parents to come. So when Prabhupada went to open the door, it was closed. My father was feeling very embarrassed about being seen with the Hare Krishnas on the street. And him and my mother were there only under duress. I'm surprised that they even came, but they came, and my father pulled open the little curtain and he saw Prabhupada trying to get in. So my father opened the door, and as Prabhupada went into the door, Prabhupada nodded at my father to say thank you. And then Prabhupada sat down on a very small vyasasana, looked around the room at all the devotees present. At that time, there were a few guests. One of those guests was Bhakta Arthur. He's not here to recall this incident, but Bhakta Arthur recalls. Bhakta Arthur was a boxer for the South Sydney Leagues Club, and he was a pretty tough guy, and he was a carpet layer, and he had a carpet laying business. He was a pretty tough sort of guy. And Prabhupada looked around the room, and then his eyes stopped and looked at Arthur. So Arthur thought, well, I'm going to look back. So Arthur was looking at Prabhupada in the eye, and Prabhupada was looking at Bhakta Arthur. And Bhakta Arthur recalled that he was looking and looking and looking, and it got to the point Prabhupada's gaze was so intense that he had to eventually look away. But he recalls that gaze of Prabhupada, and it was a look of it was an affectionate but a very grave glance at the same time. And Bhakta Arthur, who later became Ajamil, he recalled how this glance, it seemed like this glance was what brought him closer to Krishna consciousness. Along with that glance came all the blessings of of Srila Prabhupada and the disciplic succession. He felt impregnated with something very spiritual at that time.
There were a lot of times in Perth, particularly sometimes in Melbourne, I've even seen on film that I didn't remember asking Prabhupada about all the... one case I was trying to understand the 8,400,000 species of life, and I asked Prabhupada, are they, those 8 million animal forms and human, 400,000 human, are they on this planet, or are they divided by countries? Does it mean the Chinese, the Japanese, the Americans? Something like that. And Prabhupada said, no, you're thinking of this planet, but the Srimad Bhagavatam is speaking of the entire universe, the whole universe.
Prabhupada liked to walk out in the open, and especially here in Melbourne, and also Sydney. He liked to go to parks a lot, and we took him to the botanical gardens here in Melbourne, which are quite famous. He thought that actually he made a statement that the botanical garden in Melbourne is better than New York Central Park. So he very much liked it. And I was quite amazed that when Prabhupada walked through the park, he knew a lot of things that would seem a person in his position perhaps wouldn't bother even speaking about, like, what the names of the trees were. And Prabhupada would walk and he'd say, this is a such and such tree. And then he said, go and have a look. Because in the park, all the trees had little kind of name tags. So he'd send someone over, and then the devotee would come over, and he quite thought it was in Latin. They'd have the Latin name there. And he said, what is that? And he said, such and such in Latin. And he said, but what, in English? And he said, yes, just see. So he would walk along like that. And that kind of surprised me. Oh, Prabhupada he knows all these things. He knew about trees, he knew about flowers. He very much appreciated the beauty of the park. Also, I remember another time when we were walking, we were walking, it was early in the morning, I guess it was about 6 o'clock, and Prabhupada saw that Prabhupada saw that even at 6 o'clock there was heavy traffic going into the city, because these gardens were really close to the city. There was heavy traffic going into the city. And Prabhupada said, what is this traffic? And someone said, oh, they're all going to work, Prabhupada. And Prabhupada said, he stopped and he was silent, and he just said, they are working so hard. And I could see his eye was a little moist, just the stage before a tear would come. He felt, you could feel that he felt so much compassion for these people that he was concerned that they were, even early in the morning at 6 o'clock, they were racing and rushing into work. And so they are working so hard. And then another time, I think it was that same morning, he saw that some of the businessmen were driving their cars and then parking them right out at the Botanical Gardens, which was about 3 or 4 kilometres from the city. And so he was asking, what are they doing? And someone explained that, Prabhupada, they park their cars here so that they can avoid paying parking fees in the city. And Prabhupada said, just see. He said, then he gave a story, he said, a man can ride in a big carriage, but he can't afford to feed the horses. So everyone laughed. And it was so poignant at that point that here we are, someone driving a big car, big businessman wearing a suit and tie and a briefcase and everything, and then they park the car outside and have to walk 3 or 4 kilometres into the city to go to the office.
And when we cleaned his quarters, we would always change his sheets, and Prabhupada stopped that. He said, you don't change them every day, you just change when they're dirty. And of course they were never dirty, but Prabhupada wanted that. And another thing, he used to have a garland, his fresh garland. He had a picture of Radha and Krishna on his little table. And after he'd come back from his morning class and everything, he'd take off that garland and put it on a picture of Radha and Krishna on his desk. But we weren't allowed to throw it out. And on the wall there was the disciplic succession, Bhaktisiddhanta, Gaurakishore and Bhaktivinoda Thakur. So after the garland had been on the deity picture, we would take it off so that he could put the fresh one on, and then we'd place it on Bhaktisiddhanta's picture, and then the next day we'd move it down to Gaurkishore's picture. We'd be moving them all along, and then down to Bhaktivinoda Thakur's picture, and finally we could take it as prasadam. So Prabhupada was very particular about things like that. So one day I had this Bhaktivinoda Thakur's garland on, which you can imagine in the Bombay sun was quite shriveled, you know. So that day I started to think, oh gee, Prabhupada doesn't really know me, and he knows so many devotees so well, and you know, he hardly knows me, and I was feeling, you know, a little bad that I don't get to do very much for Srila Prabhupada, and I was making his vases, which I did every day, and I used to take them up at 11 o'clock. At that time Prabhupada was always having his massage. So that day, the very day I'd been thinking that, I went upstairs and Prabhupada was in his room. So I stopped in fear, in awe, you know, and then I walked in, I put the vases down and offered obeisances, and I was flustered and I was trying to back out of the room. And Prabhupada, he looked at that old garland and he said, "Where from you got this garland?" And he said, "Here, you take this one." And he reached down and he took the fresh garland from that morning that he just put over the picture of the deities, and he gave it to me. Oh, so I felt so happy, and I realized that Prabhupada, he knows what we need. He knows exactly what we need in spiritual life, and it was just so much encouragement from Srila Prabhupada. Then I felt also foolish that I'd had to think like that, and that Prabhupada had had to cater to me. But still, it was very treasured for me, you know, that had happened.
For Prabhupada's second visit to Melbourne, for Prabhupada's second visit to Australia, Prabhupada was coming to Melbourne for the first time, and when Prabhupada arrived at the temple, I do recall Krishna Premi was crying, and she was trying to sing Vande Hum, Sri Guru, on harmonium, and crying at the same time, and it was quite an intense affair, but it was done with great affection and sincerity, and Prabhupada nodded and smiled at Krishna Premi. And I remember Upananda had made a big plate of Simply Wonderfuls, which was the #1 delicacy in those days. Somehow or other, Simply Wonderfuls were like the summum bonum of life. Some devotees made their own Simply Wonderfuls on the side. Ajamil was famous. He got Gaurangi, Raghunath's wife, to make him an extra large bead bag, and we weren't sure the reason behind it until one day I discovered that inside Ajamil's bead bag, along with his beads, was a small packet of sunshine powdered milk, a packet of butter, and a packet of icing sugar. So Ajamil sometimes used to sneak out the back and roll his own. So we were very addicted to Simply Wonderfuls, and Upananda had made these Simply Wonderfuls. He offered a plate to Srila Prabhupada, and Prabhupada, I don't think he took any, but he nodded, and then he made a gesture to distribute the Simply Wonderfuls to everyone. I was very much into rules and regulations. I was very pedantic in those days, and probably the best man for being the temple commander, although I must have offended probably every devotee in Australia. But all I could think of was at the time when the Simply Wonderfuls were coming around, I was thinking, but we just read in the Nectar of Devotion a couple of days ago that we shouldn't eat in front of the deity. So I was thinking maybe this is an offence. But I saw everyone else eat their Simply Wonderfuls, and I was very perplexed. I was thinking perhaps we're all committing a great offence here. But in fact, of course, taking prasadam from Srila Prabhupada is beyond any rules and regulations.
I remember one thing that he said really affected me. He asked Upendra, are you studying my books? And Upendra said, yes, Prabhupada, I read your books every day. And Prabhupada thumped the desk. You read my books, but I said, do you study my books? And Prabhupada was emphatic. He said, you must know the meaning of every word. If you learn a verse, don't just don't just learn the verse, like you must know the meaning of every word. He was very emphatic, like study. The difference between studying and reading. So I took a little bit to heart at the time.
I know Prabhupada wasn't very keen on our men making movies. You know, there was a discussion that Gyanagamya had with him in Iran in August of '76, and he was very keen on that at that time of making a big commercial, full-scale movie. You know, the millions of dollars thing, and he had this idea that somehow or another it would popularize the movement. His idea was to show some scenario where the devotees were involved and people could see how we lived and get an appreciation from them. Prabhupada dismissed it. Gyanagamya brought up 5 or 6 different angles. He was desperately trying to get a yes from Prabhupada, but Prabhupada would not give him an endorsement for it at all. And he said, for the kind of money that you're spending, this was one of the arguments that he used, he said, the kind of money that you would spend on that, he said, how many books could you distribute? He said, and I have personal experience anyway, expending so much money and getting practically no result. He said, when I first went to New York, he said, then I put an ad classified in the New York Times. So he said, at that time it cost me so much money, I had practically nothing. For one small ad, it ran for 1 or 2 days or something. He said, I got 3 responses, and none of them bought my books. So he said, I have personal experience, this is, a waste of time. Well, I mean, as far as movies go as well, because in India, you can make movies about Krishna. And they've done it very often. But, they always want to focus in on Krishna's 10th canto, Gopi Leelas and things like this. So I remember when we were in Bhubaneswar, this was in late January and very early February of '77. So this movie maker came, 2 or 3 of them came, and they explained to Srila Prabhupada that we're making a movie, we want to popularize Krishna's pastimes. Now Hare Krishna is becoming very popular, and we want that everybody should know about Krishna, and we want to show Krishna's Vrindavan pastimes. And so, we'd like, you are the guru of the Hare Krishna movement, so we would like to get your blessings for making this movie, and we'd also like to just put a little mention of our humble thanks, for the work that you've done in popularizing Krishna's pastimes on the movie. So Prabhupada immediately, told them no. He said, why do you want to immediately jump to Krishna's 10th canto pastimes? So they were saying, but Swamiji, everybody in India is a Krishna Bhakta. And Prabhupada told him, he said, nobody will understand. You'll show them and they'll take it as some mythology. Krishna killing the Trinivata whirlwind or whatever. He said, then they'll all think it's simply mythology. So then they said, oh, but Swamiji, everybody in India, they're all Krishna Bhaktas. So the evening before, Prabhupada had a conversation with a man who had asked him, actually, who is Krishna? Prabhupada was shocked. He's an Indian man, supposed to be educated, asking who is Krishna, and he chastised him like anything. He was in a darshan. And Prabhupada said, you're born in India, you do not know who is Krishna? And then when he had given his evening lecture, he brought it up in the lecture also, that, here we are in Punya Bhumi, in Bharata Bhumi, and now people are so degraded that they're asking who is Krishna. So now this film man came a day or 2 later, and he said, oh, but Swamiji, everybody's a Krishna Bhakta. Prabhupada said, you say that they're Krishna Bhaktas, but he is asking who is Krishna. So he said, why don't you make a movie of the 1st canto? You show that first, and then progress. You go progressively through the Bhagavatam, and then you can do the 10th canto. But of course, they wanted the 10th canto, Krishna with the gopis and this and that. But Prabhupada would not give them an endorsement, because they were simply trying to, capitalize on Prabhupada's popularity. Oh, this movie is approved by Bhaktivedanta Swami. But Prabhupada would not give him an approval. And after about half an hour, again, they brought up various arguments. Prabhupada would not budge an inch on it. He refused. He said, if you make one of the first canto, then we'll see.
At different times we were playing the materialist in the morning walks, and then some time would pass. So at one point, Ganesh Prabhu, he posed a question, but it wasn't in a context where one could see that this was posing as materialist. And he was just asked if he said, Srila Prabhupada, if the Bhagavad Gita is 5,000 years old, and Prabhupada said, what? Bhagavad Gita is not 5,000 years old. Have you read Bhagavad Gita? He says, yes, a little. Then you should know. You're a student of Bhagavad Gita, and you think it was written 5,000 years ago? And he started to walk. Millions of years. Bhagavad Gita, he began to explain. They stopped and said, you should know. He was getting really heavily chastised. But then I said, maybe he was posing as a materialist, Prabhupada. So I said, even so, one should know Bhagavad Gita was not written 5,000 years ago.
One time I think there was myself and Pushta Krishna and Achyutananda in Mayapur, and we were talking about, consciousness and whether every living being is conscious or not. And Achyutananda was trying to argue that actually they're not. The soul may be there, but the consciousness is not displayed. And he said, if you start thinking that every living being is conscious, then you'll go crazy. Because then you'll think, well, all the atoms in the floor are conscious, so if I tread on the floor it will hurt them, or if I close the door too hard, they'll all scream or something. So I was not really satisfied with, his reply to that. And so I went straight in to see Srila Prabhupada and I asked him about it. And then Prabhupada was able to immediately point out a verse in the first canto. And then he gave me this example of how, there's the skin and the nail. So if you cut the skin, then immediately you're hurt. But if you cut the nail, you can do that without any difficulty. So he gave that as an example of how there are different states coming from the same source, but there are different states, and therefore everything is actually, it's Krishna. Everything is Krishna, but Krishna's energies work in different ways. So matter, spirit is actually the same, it's from the same source, but according to how it's used. So that was one question I was able to get cleared up there.
In Bombay I was cooking Prabhupada's, or cleaning after the breakfast, and I helped Diva Shakti. I made Prabhupada's breakfast and then I was cleaning up, and that was, it was all, I was trying to do it really quietly, and then Prabhupada was going to take rest after that. For some reason he was going to take rest, so I took a long time to clean up. I wanted to do it nicely, and then all of a sudden I noticed it was really quiet in his apartment. And it was so quiet, and I thought, gee, it's really quiet, and Prabhupada must be taking rest. So I went to go out of the apartment in Bombay. It was on the 3rd floor, and I was locked in, and I was just totally terrified that I was locked in with Prabhupada, who was a sannyasi, and the servant was gone, and I couldn't get out. And I thought, if Prabhupada wakes up and finds me here after he's taken his rest, I'll be in such big trouble. And I thought, I was like this panic thing, what am I going to do? Eventually I sort of went out onto the balcony and, was waiting for someone to walk by, and I see someone walk by. Help! Can you get someone to let me out? I didn't want to wake Prabhupada up, so I thought, this was the second time that had happened, because when I was in Sydney, I went to clean. They took me over to clean the apartment while Prabhupada went for his morning walk. And so, lo and behold, Prabhupada came back untimely quickly. He came back to get something, then he was going back to the temple, so I think it was Bhagavan who came in and sort of, what are you doing here? I said, I'm just cleaning, He said, you can't be here, or something he was saying. I didn't know what was going on, and sort of shoveled me behind the door, and said, wait here, Prabhupada's not supposed to see him, he's going to get changed or something. I thought, so I'm standing behind the door like this, and I'm thinking, what do I do now, and I could see Prabhupada was taking his jumper off through the crack. I thought, oh no, I can see him getting chased. I think, well, you know, they just left me here like this, you know. And so anyway, all of a sudden the whole fanfare went out through the door and off, and I'm left behind the door, you know, I'm thinking, will I come out? And they just left me there. And I thought, you know, oh well, you know, okay. So I thought, no, you know, so it's just, I have this sort of lead of getting locked in Prabhupada's quarters and, you know, not supposed to be there, and, you know, it's just like the story of, it was hard for women in those days, because it was always like you were never supposed to be anywhere, but at the same time you're supposed to do all these things, you know. And you're always supposed to be invisible. But so it's really funny, actually. Before, when I heard I had to speak this morning, I have to tell you this. And Bigger said to me, you know, it's us three, we've got to say something. And I said, oh no, I said, because this morning we were sort of lamenting, oh, we're at the back of the temple again, you know, and you go, but we're so liberated because we've all got one side for the women, one side for here, and here it's really right-wing in Melbourne. You know, we're all down the back, and I said, you know, well, they push us all down the back, and as soon as they need us for something, here we are up the front having to speak again, you know. I thought it was just a really funny thing. And Rookie said, yes, you say that when you get up there, so for Rukmavati, I say that.
Prabhupada went to Scotland for the opening of the temple, and it was quite an interesting press conference. All these sort of, you know, weary, hard-edged kind of journalists, cynical journalists mostly, had assembled from various Scottish newspapers, and Prabhupada had a connection with Scotland that most people weren't aware of at that time. That in fact he was educated by Scottish missionaries in Calcutta, the school he attended. So he knew a bit more about Scottish people in Scotland than we thought he might know. And I think the press people might have had an idea about that. So there was, I remember it quite well because we were in his room. It was quite a small room, but there might have been 10 or 15 journalists there, along with maybe 8 or 10 of devotees. And they were asking these questions. They were sort of cynical kind of questions. Some of them were almost rude, like challenging. Why have you come here? What purpose are you doing? What do you hope to achieve? That kind of thing. And Prabhupada answered very, very, very nicely. He maintained his composure completely, and he gave, you know, eloquent answers and quoted a bit from the Bhagavad Gita. And in a sense, they were becoming won over, as most people usually were. It didn't take very long. And one of the journalists, I'll never forget this, he became so either frustrated or didn't quite know what to ask Prabhupada in a kind of an offhand manner. He asked Prabhupada, he said, so do you know everything? Like that. And Prabhupada kind of took his time to answer, and he nodded his head and he said yes. But then he didn't just say yes like that, obviously, he purported it a bit, he added a little something to it. But that was a classical moment, you know, where that question was asked of him, and he thought, and he answered directly and honestly, and he just said yes. And at that moment, there was like a feeling right throughout the room, amongst the devotees and amongst the journalists, that, you know, perhaps it was true. I mean, and after that, the whole mood changed. They became very light-hearted.
We were walking back from that square near the British Museum, and there were only a few devotees there. There were only about 2 or 3 devotees with Prabhupada, and it had been on my mind for some reason or other. So I just said, "Does the Pope make spiritual advancement?" And he answered immediately and said, "Yes, because he's engaged in God's work." And we'd heard stories about the Pope doesn't follow the regulative principles or anything like this. So it was quite a surprise. But he was very definite about that he was engaged in God's work. And I thought about that for many, many years, actually. It's quite an interesting subject.
I'd kind of been wanting to get married for some time. Actually, in LA, you know, but some things it never worked out in LA. Anyhow, so at that time, Prabhupada was practically giving sannyas, it seemed like, to everybody. You know, people that just, he seemed like kind of like a mercy gift, you know, like Guru Das. Not that I'm saying anything bad, but he was like giving all these people. So, although in my heart I didn't really buy into it, between Rameshwar, mainly Rameshwar, and maybe Gopa Vrindapal or a couple others, they were convincing me, you should take sannyas, you should take sannyas. So we were in this kind of darshan with Prabhupada. There were probably 30 devotees. I was probably 15 feet back from Prabhupada. Jayatirtha was right beside me. Rameshwar was standing behind Prabhupada. And so he's standing behind, there was kind of a lull in the discussion. And Rameshwar catches my eyes and he goes, so I know what he means. So I kind of stammer, Srila Prabhupada? He goes, yes. I don't know, I've been talking with some of the devotees, and I don't know if it's a good idea or not, but there's a thought that maybe it'd be a good move or a good thing for me to take sannyas. So Prabhupada said, well, how long have you been a brahmachari? And I said, 5 years. And he said, oh, very nice. And then he said, what about the fire? Or he said, what about the butter? He said, either one of those things. I think, let's just say he said, what about the butter? And I was kind of going, what about the butter? I'm going, and Jayatirtha whispers to me, he goes, you know, the women, fire, butter. So instead of being truthful with Prabhupada and saying, listen, Prabhupada, I'd really like to have some, you know, some female association and all that goes with it. I said, Prabhupada, as long as I'm traveling and preaching, everything is fine. That's a little bit of a thing. So Prabhupada said, okay, so you can take sannyas. So I said, oh, so should we bring my name up then at this Mayapur and then I wait a year? And he says, no, you take this year. Holy shit! Holy, what am I going to do? So I'm really at a, you know, kind of like, he's already told me I'm going to take sannyas. This is like in in a few months' time. So I'm looking around for like, well, what am I going to do? Because I don't vision myself like any of these other sannyasis. So at this same time, Prabhupada, I think, went to Hawaii after leaving LA, and they had that boat there that they wanted, but nobody could skip it or anything. And I love the water. My sun and moon are in Pisces. I've always lived on the water. I just love the water, and I thought, ooh, this is a nice idea. So I wrote up a whole proposal of like a traveling Sankirtan party on a boat. And I'd even gone and seen this schooner, this big Gloucester schooner, 120 foot, and the guy was going to train us on how to do it, and we had a whole program, and Rameshwar was behind it for book distribution. And because I knew I better find something to do if I'm going to take sannyas, because I'm not just going to go around the temples and give lectures, I was a manager. So I could see me managing the boat and on the boat and, you know, coming into the town, and it would have been fun. And it seemed like it was something Prabhupada wanted. So I wrote him this whole big thing about my idea and preaching with the boat. And he wrote back this little short paragraph, why waste time sailing, better to fly instead. So I took, okay, I got it. Anyhow, Rameshwar really liked the idea. He really, really, really liked the idea, because I think it was the heyday of book distribution and the Sankirtan. This would be connected with the LA temple, so it'd be another feather in the LA temple growing, you know, empire there, which it was big. Everything was there at that time practically. Fate was there, and all the artists and all that kind of thing. Anyhow, so I took it fine. Prabhupada said, you know, all right, what am I going to do? I still got sannyas looking at me. So anyhow, in some long-distance calls between Rameshwar and Harikesh, Prabhupada was in Bombay translating. Rameshwar is talking to Harikesh, and he's trying to get Harikesh to bring this idea up again. that this is a good idea, and the boat and everything, and So anyhow, I guess Hari Kesh did me a real favor. And when he was explaining to Prabhupada, I guess, about the boat, and, like maybe I don't know what happened because nobody would tell me, but Prabhupada asked, well, why is he so anxious for doing this? I wasn't anxious for doing it, but Prabhupada asked that. So I think Hari Kesh said something like, well, Prabhupada, he's in L.A., and there's all these women around, and, he's agitated or whatever, and this would be a good way, he'll always be out. And anyhow, so Prabhupada writes this scathing letter, didn't even write it to me, he writes it to Rameshwar, who wouldn't even show it to me for years. I've got a copy of the letter now. And it's in it, Prabhupada just... He just saved me. He said, what a, rascal, lowest of mankind, fool, bad example, taking sannyas, all this kind of stuff. And Rameshwar was so afraid that I'd freak out if I saw it, he wouldn't even show it to me. He had Jayatirtha break the news to me in a gentle way. But the minute I heard that Prabhupada had said that basically I couldn't take sannyas, I just felt saved. So I was duplicitous with my spiritual master. I was, when in Laguna Beach, when I had told him, as long as I'm traveling and preaching, then I'm fine. And by his grace, he straightened it out. And the minute that letter came, in the core of my being, I was so thankful. I was relieved because I had done something stupid. I did stupid first thing, I'd asked to take sannyas. And the second stupid thing was not being just straightforward with Prabhupada. If I'd have said, Prabhupada, well, I'm really, not really thinking I'm sannyas material, but this has come up, and I really would like to get married and have a really nice wife, he'd have probably, I would imagine, instructed me down those lines. Maybe he would, maybe he wouldn't, but I didn't give him the chance to, I didn't give him the information to kind of give me the instruction.
As they were leaving, she said, should we leave too, Srila Prabhupada? And he said, not unless you have some questions. And we both go, no, we don't have any questions. We both offer obeisances at the same time. Actually, we did have questions. So as we both get up from paying obeisances, we simultaneously start asking questions. Anyway, I let her go first. She asked a question. She said, Srila Prabhupada, I heard that in yesterday's darshan, you said that a sannyasi's business is to preach. Brahmachari's business is to assist the sannyasis. And the householder, the grihasta's business, is to do deity worship. So what about us brahmacharinis? Can we do deity worship? And actually we were doing a lot of deity worship. We were doing most of the deity worship in Bombay at the time for Radha Rasa Bihari in the old temple. And he said, yes, you can also do deity worship. So she was satisfied with her answer. So then I asked my question. This is a question I had been thinking for a long time. And what I wanted to ask and what I did ask were two different things. I had heard from my friend Chintamani Prabhu that he had given her instructions to worship Lord Jagannath because her husband was Sudama and he had taken sannyas. And there was a deity of Lord Jagannath in Japan. I believe they were installed, but they were her deities. He told her on two different occasions to make Jagannath your husband, Subhadra your daughter, and Balaram your son. It's a very personal instruction. And then I also knew from Nandalal Prabhu that he had given her a deity of Krishna right off his desk. He had given her a deity and told her to worship this deity. I think it was a silver deity of Lord Krishna that someone had given him, and it was on his desk in Los Angeles. So I knew about these two ladies, and they were both in a renounced position. One, the husband took sannyas, the other was older and didn't want to get married. And I was thinking, I was very old. I was 29. And I was thinking I was very old and I wasn't going to get married. And so I was thinking, I was like them, and I wanted instruction like them. But yet I didn't really have that close of personal relationship with Prabhupada, so I wanted to ask, can I have my own deity? And I just couldn't do it. I just couldn't do it. I had to say, Srila Prabhupada, can devotees have their own deities? And his answer was, no. And then he said, because that will distract from the temple deity. So I took that instruction to mean that if you're going to get absorbed in your own deity worship, then you don't want to take the time to worship the temple deity. And that was the main lesson.
Once he was actually paraphrasing Prahlad Maharaj, and so many times he would paraphrase Srimad Bhagavatam or Bhagavad Gita, but in such a natural way that you would think he was just speaking as he was thinking. So at the time there were construction workers staying on Hare Krishna land, and in the distance he heard a small child crying. And later I found that he was paraphrasing Prahlad Maharaj, but he said that even in the presence of the mother, who gives all care to the child, still the child is crying. What is the reason? And then he gave the answer that one who is not cared for and protected by the Lord, even in the presence of the mother and the father, he can suffer. So he's saying that whatever we do on our own, we may or may not succeed. We depend on the care and protection of the Lord.
There was one man who had come, perhaps for the first time. He looked like a really strong lumberjack man. And he called out and challenged in a loud voice after the lecture, "How do you know that God eats?" So Prabhupada said very calmly, "God says I eat in the Bhagavad Gita. So I may be a fool number one, but who should I believe, God or a rascal like you?" And then he was, around the same time, he spoke about prasadam in the lectures, and he said, the father gives the boy his supper, and they're sitting at the table eating supper. And the boy says, "Here, Father, you take first, or you taste it." So the father doesn't need the food from the son. In fact, he provided it. But just the fact that the son offered it, he said, "Oh yes, it looks very nice, I'll take it." And just the fact that he offered it increases the loving relationship. So he was teaching us the mentality. Then he said, people criticize that you simply cut up some fruit and you call it prasadam. I said, yes, it is prasadam. Even an atheist can taste the difference between an unoffered chapati and an offered chapati.
When Prabhupada first went to Mayapur with his American disciples, they bought a piece of land in Mayapur, and so Prabhupada actually drove straight to Mayapur, our place. It was just a small hut that they built for Srila Prabhupada, without stopping at Gaudiya Math, Chaitanya Math, and Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur's Samadhi. So some of his godbrothers commented that he didn't even stop at his spiritual master's Samadhi. So when Prabhupada heard about that, when Prabhupada was told that they were speaking like that, then Prabhupada commented, "Do they think that I am ever separated from my spiritual master even for a moment? My spiritual master is always with me." And that is how a disciple should always be conscious of his spiritual master. Like spiritual master is none other than the super soul. The spiritual master is the super soul, or actually even more than the super soul. The yogis, when they attain perfection, they see the super soul in the heart. A devotee, when he attains perfection, he sees his spiritual master in the heart. So pure devotion means to see his spiritual master in his heart all the time. So more we become Krishna conscious, more we make spiritual advancement, the more we will see Srila Prabhupada in our hearts. And we are seeing, like, actually that's the benefit of being in ISKCON. Like everywhere we see Srila Prabhupada. Prabhupada's temples, Prabhupada's deities, Prabhupada's books, Prabhupada's devotees, everything is Srila Prabhupada. And that's what is actually not only protecting us from the onslaughts of Maya, but automatically pushing us towards our ultimate destination, Krishna's lotus feet.
With a businessman, he would give a business example. Like with Mr. Mota, who was a businessman, he said that according to Chanakya Pandit, at the time of death, even if we're willing to spend crores of rupees, we cannot get one moment more to live. So he was saying that that means that every moment is worth crores of rupees. And the time that is spent in Krishna consciousness is profit. And the time that is not spent in Krishna consciousness is loss. So he said, you make your balance sheet, and you see the profit and the loss, and you use all your time in Krishna consciousness.
So after the class, one boy stood up and asked, well, isn't it all like a dream? And when you wake up from the dream, you see that there's really nothing there from the dream. So don't we lose our individuality and just kind of merge? That was the big philosophy of the time, merging. So Prabhupada said, well, you're not the person in the dream, but it doesn't mean you're not a person. You're somebody who had the dream. And although you were thinking that you were somebody else in the dream, when you wake up, you realize who you are. So that's how Krishna consciousness is.
So every morning, Dr. Patel would come to Juhu and take Srila Prabhupada in his car to Juhu Beach in the bad weather. And in the good weather, he would just walk with Srila Prabhupada to Juhu Beach. But Dr. Patel was sort of a Mayavadi. At least sometimes Srila Prabhupada would call him a Mayavadi, although he would deny it and say that he was a Vaishnava. So one morning, Srila Prabhupada criticized some famous Mayavadi sannyasi of India. And Dr. Patel really got upset. He really felt offended, and ultimately he left. So later, the devotees were very upset with Dr. Patel because he was always arguing with Srila Prabhupada. And when Srila Prabhupada, to his mind, insulted one of his gurus, Dr. Patel really argued with Srila Prabhupada. He actually chastised Srila Prabhupada. And Srila Prabhupada argued back. I'm not saying, Krishna is saying. The devotees were very upset. And so later, Tamal Krishna Goswami asked Srila Prabhupada that, why do you spend so much time with him? And Srila Prabhupada said, we have to engage everyone. But, it was very hard to understand Dr. Patel. Was he a Mayavadi? Was he a Vaishnava? And Srila Prabhupada told a story that once there was a man who spoke many languages, and nobody could figure out what his original language was. And everyone in the village wanted to know. They wanted to know who they were dealing with. What is his mother tongue? Where does he come from? But whatever language you would speak to him, he would respond perfectly and immediately in the same language. So, how to find out? Then one man said, I will find out. So once, when the other person wasn't looking, he came from behind and gave him a slap. And immediately he started cursing in his original language. So Srila Prabhupada said that Dr. Patel was like him, that whatever language you spoke to Dr. Patel, he would respond in the same language. But when we hit on the sensitive point, then his real language, then he spoke in his real language.
Then we asked about having children. And at that time, one of the reasons that Prabhupada married me because of my health, so it still wasn't very good. In fact, it got a little worse. So we asked about having children, and Prabhupada wrote to us that, first we asked if we could be like Bhaktivinoda Thakur and pray for a ray of Vishnu, like he did. You know, and Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur came as his son. So Prabhupada wrote back, we cannot imitate the acharyas, we can only follow in their footsteps, so you shouldn't pray for a ray of Vishnu. Then, finally, the conclusion of all these children letters was that because my health wasn't good, he said, better if you both become children of Krishna rather than try to have a child for Krishna. If the mother is ill when she's pregnant, then the baby will come out sick and will be a burden both on the child and on the parents. Then I had a lot of problems with submission, as a lot of Western-grown people did. And because Satsrup Maharaj was the editor of Prabhupada's Bhagavatams, we would get the manuscripts first. He would type and edit, so we got first before anybody on the planet. So one thing I read from the transcription was, it was the story of Devahuti and Kardama Muni. Finished? Devahuti and Kardama Muni. And she was a great princess, but she gave up her prestige and served her husband like a menial servant. And in that passage, Prabhupada wrote that the wife shares the pious activities, pious results of the husband, if she serves him. So I wasn't too much in favor of being the recipient of somebody else's pious activities. I wanted to be the benefactor of the pious activities and take that role, take the predominant role. So I thought, well, probably this is just, ancient Vedic culture, and it doesn't apply to me. I hoped it didn't. So I wrote to Prabhupada, and I quoted that verse in the Bhagavatam, and I said, I'm writing this to you for confirmation. So Prabhupada wrote back, he said, yes, it is confirmed by me that the wife is the shareholder of the husband's pious activities, so you should know that Sriman Satsarup, his life fully dedicated to Krishna, you should follow his instructions. Of course, he cannot stop or interfere with your service to me, but at least you should follow the general instructions. I realized I had to do better.
And then I started to tell him what actually happened. That I told him about Bhima's Mahaprasthan. Prabhupada heard about that, and right after that Prabhupada was planning to go for a parikrama of Govardhan, And I feel Prabhupada is actually planning to go on a Mahaprasthan himself, the final departure. And then Babaji Maharaj said, then we can't let him go. Then I said, Babaji Maharaj, the only person who can convince Prabhupada not to go is you. So Babaji Maharaj was so humble, he said, me? How can I tell him? So I said, you are the only person who can actually convince him. So then Babaji Maharaj, he just got up, washed his hands and mouth, and walked straight up to Srila Prabhupada and said, I heard everything, and I feel that you should not go to Parikrama. Then Prabhupada said, Babaji Maharaj, if you say so, then I will not go. And at that time, we kind of took it for granted that Srila Prabhupada came to Vrindavan to leave his body. And so around that time, Tamal Krishna Maharaj one day, he told me that we don't really know what to do if Prabhupada leaves his body. If Prabhupada left his body, we didn't know what to do. So he asked me to find out from Krishna's Babaji Maharaj. And so, I went one afternoon, late afternoon, I went to Madhav Maharaj's mat, where Krishna's Babaji Maharaj was staying. So I went, but Babaji Maharaj was not there. So waiting for him for a while, I just came back. So when I came back, Upendra Prabhu, who was Prabhupada's servant at that time, told me that Prabhupada was looking for me. So I ran into Prabhupada's room and asked him whether he wanted me to do anything. So Prabhupada asked, where did you go? Where were you? So I said, Prabhupada, I went to Madhav Maharaj's mat. So Prabhupada asked, why did you go there? I mean, his voice was ringing with anger, he said, why did you go there? And I couldn't answer, why I went there. It was, how could I say why I went there? And I was just silent, and then Prabhupada's voice kept on, rising, and he was screaming, why did you go there? So finally I said, Prabhupada, I went to see Krishna's Babaji Maharaj. And then Prabhupada's voice became even louder with anger. And he asked, why did you go there? So I finally said, Prabhupada, Tamal Krishna Maharaj wanted me to go there. And then Prabhupada said, oh, I see. He became quiet. From that, I learned a lesson that Prabhupada didn't want us to go out to anybody. Although he had such a good relationship with Babaji Maharaj, still he didn't want us to go to him. And that actually, it makes it, later on I got to know, how Prabhupada said that if they say one thing different from me, then everything will be spoiled. And that's why Prabhupada didn't want us to go anywhere. He was like a caring father, who was just protecting us from any danger.
Then in Srila Prabhupada's last days, when he visited Bombay and he could just lie on the bed, nothing more, he was remembering his struggle in Juhu. And he kept trying to say something. He wanted to say something. That dog. And we couldn't understand what he meant, whether he meant Mr. N or that dog. And then finally it came out that at one stage he was staying at the house of Mr. Krishna Kapoor. And Mr. Krishna Kapoor had a big dog. And every morning he would drive Srila Prabhupada to Juhu Beach to walk. And the dog would sit next to Srila Prabhupada in the car. So Srila Prabhupada was just, when he was thinking over all that he had done to get the Juhu land, he thought of that dog, that he had to ride in a car next to a dog. So, Srila Prabhupada was not of this world. Just for him to be in the material world was such a sacrifice. But even within the material world, he made so much sacrifice just for the sake of us, the sake of the fallen souls, the sake of spreading Krishna consciousness. And I think that probably all of Srila Prabhupada's good qualities came together in the one effort to spread Krishna consciousness. And if we could just dedicate ourselves and surrender to Srila Prabhupada's mood and mission of spreading Krishna consciousness, we would also be forced to develop all good qualities and get the result or get the reward of Prabhupada's mercy. And there's nothing higher than that.
And then Prabhupada dismissed us all. Then he called me back. And he pointed to 64 million. He said, "This is all your credit. 64 million. I know, Prabhupada, it's all your credit. You are so encouraging to us." So he said a couple of nice things like that about me. You don't need a GBC. He doesn't need a GBC. All this credit is his. And I'm sure, he said about others in different ways also. And for them it was true. For me it was just encouraging words that he was giving. But this was later, but in 1975, when he said he doesn't need a GBC, that year they passed a resolution that no one will take sannyas unless they're recommended by the GBC and they wait for 1 year. And so that was approved by Prabhupada. And then in Vrindavan, in 1975, Prabhupada of course went to Vrindavan, and I was there, and I was very, very ill, very sick. But I was very enthusiastic to carry on. I had amoebic dysentery. I weighed 118 pounds. My ribs were sticking out everywhere. Achyutananda Swami suggested, you should take sannyas. You're a very, very renounced kind of person, he said. So others had suggested, and Ramaswami had already tried to get Prabhupada to give me sannyas earlier. And so I didn't think much of it, but I got some deep realization when Prabhupada opened the Krishna Balaram temple. We had all worked so hard to sell books and raise money, and others directly raised money for the opening of the temple. It was a great struggle for Prabhupada. And I saw him doing that arti to Krishna Balaram. At that time I was so touched, so deeply touched, that such a wonderful thing Prabhupada wanted so much. It's been done, and somehow we've been instruments in this. The glory of watching him offer the arti to Krishna and Balaram. It was so wonderful that I couldn't... Vishaka was behind me, and she was a photographer for the preaching and so forth. And there was quite a push and a shove to get close to Prabhupada and witness this. And I was pushing and shoving, and she was behind me, and she was trying to pull, and she said, "Maharaj, it's for the preaching," because its preaching was so important to get forward. And she went on the one and wanted me to let her in front of her, and I said, "The hell with the preaching." I thought, I'm not moving from here. I'm going to watch this moment in eternity. Prabhupada offering arti to Krishna and Balaram. Anyway, I got so much inspiration at that time. Hansaduta was there, and tears were flowing from his eyes like anything, and standing next to me, and I was also choked up and crying. And I thought I must take all formal steps to dedicate myself to Prabhupada in every way. So I went to Prabhupada, and they didn't even want to let me in, whoever his secretary was, but I got in anyway. And I told him, "Prabhupada, I think I'd like to take sannyas," but I was so submissive. My nature was, I'm known to be very independent in some ways, and like a maverick and rebellious, but really, there's both sides to me, and to Prabhupada I was very, very, very submissive. And I was afraid to ask anything of him. To ask anything, you do something for me. You give me sannyas. If you don't want it, the message I was trying to send, I don't want it. but I'm thinking that maybe you'll want it, and I want it only because I have some idea that it will draw me closer to you by making that kind of commitment. So I tried to explain all these things to Prabhupada when he asked why you should take it, and he kind of played with me. He said, you are, he knew me, of course, and he said, so you are brahmachari? And I said, oh, Prabhupada, it's me, Tripurari, it's me, I was thinking in my mind. And I said, I had a wife when I joined, but then she left, and she said, oh, Vanaprastha, then. And so he was kind of playing with me, and he said, so you will be taking, if you take sannyas, then what if you give it up? I said, Prabhupada, I would never do that. I thought, it's out of love, I want to do this for you. He said, others have said, and they have gone. And then I thought, well, maybe he doesn't want. So I kind of thought, gosh, I don't want to force my idea on the higher. This is not bhakti. Bhakti is to take their idea and do their bidding, not to impose my idea upon them. So I went a little further and explained in relation to preaching, and mostly it was hidden motive. As I said, I want to get into your quarters whenever I can, and I just feel I want to be as closely connected with you as possible, and you can get one initiation, you can get two, you get three, so I want all three. So then he said, I backed off. I said, well, anyway, Prabhupada, I don't want to push it and anything. And he didn't say no, he didn't say yes, he was kind of amused by it. And then I thought, I should do the right thing. And so I went to every GBC member who was there, and I told them, I'm thinking of taking sannyas. And they had just passed a rule that you couldn't do that. But they had also just been told he doesn't need a GBC. So I guess they took that to heart, and none of them opposed me except Brahmananda. He's the only one. Prabhupada gave this order, and you have to be recommended. And I guess my adherence to them at that time was maybe a little bit superficial, because I heeded everyone's advice except Ramananda's. He said no, and everyone else said yes. Or maybe I just took it the majority roles here. And when I went to Tamal Krishna Maharaj, he had heard Tripuram was talking to different GBCs about taking sannyas, and it came to him, and I came and asked me, he said, yes, you should do it immediately. Let's go to Prabhupada. So he dragged me back down to Srila Prabhupada. And then he said, Prabhupada Tripuram wants to take sannyas. And all of us think it's a wonderful idea. So Prabhupada says, then tomorrow he will take sannyas. So my sannyas was kind of in violation of the GBC resolution in a sense.
Then Srila Prabhupada asked if we had any questions, again, as he did after the lecture. So I had been studying, I think I had read the Bhagavad Gita, that little blue one we had. I think by that time I had read it about 12 or 14 times. I was a very avid reader. And one of my favorite parts was the modes of material nature. And being very philosophical in nature, I wanted to understand some of the more refined and subtle points. And so I said to him, I'm confused because throughout your books and in your lectures you say that when you become a devotee, you're on the transcendental platform. But at the same time, you talk about being affected by the modes of material nature. And although I'm a devotee, and I'm practicing the principles of devotional service, and experiencing a certain amount of transcendental pleasure, at the same time, I feel affected by the modes of material nature. So how is it that I could be on the transcendental platform and still be affected by the modes of material nature? And he smiled. He liked that question. He saw that it was thoughtful and introspective. And he said, that is a very good question. And he said, it is just like being on a boat. He said, when you're on the boat, no one can say you're not on the boat. You're on the boat. He said, but when you sail on the boat, sometimes very big waves will come and rock the boat. And so your position on the boat will not be very steady. He said those waves are the modes of material nature, and the boat is the transcendental platform. You're on the transcendental platform, but sometimes the waves of material nature rock the boat, and your position is not steady. He said, so how will you become steady? He said, then you have to learn from the captain of the boat, that is the spiritual master, how to steer the boat. And if one learns expertly from the captain how to steer the boat, then even in the greatest storm, your position in the boat will become steady. He said, so similarly, on the transcendental platform, if you learn from the spiritual master how to steer the boat of transcendence through the ocean of material life, then you will become steady even in the greatest storm of the modes of material nature. I was extremely impressed at how Prabhupada had taken a complex situation and explained it with a very simple analogy.
One analogy he gave was 1966 or 67, he began his Prahlad Maharaj series when Prahlad would speak to his classmates when his teachers were out. And one example was about in an airplane, you have a driver and a motor. Without the motor, the plane doesn't run. And without the driver, even with the motor, the plane doesn't run. So without the soul in the body, even if you have all the mechanical arrangements, the body doesn't work. And then he said, if you take a teeny drop of poison, like ptomaine poison, even though the body is so big and so complicated, if you put one small drop of ptomaine poisoning in it, life is finished. So why not, if you have a little tiny soul, 1/10,000th of the tip of the hair, if that's in the body, it brings the whole body to life.
And I remember going into the room where Srila Prabhupada was, and he didn't have a shirt on at the time. He had just taken his bath and was putting on tilak. And when he saw us, he was very, very happy, and I offered my dandavats. And Gargamuni Maharaj introduced me to Srila Prabhupada. He said, oh, he has given up going to medical school to become a devotee. And he found out that we had just come from East Bengal, where a war was going on. And Srila Prabhupada was very, very grateful. He said that you have risked your life for me and for Lord Chaitanya. And he was so grateful. And he asked me, so you like our books? I said, yes, Srila Prabhupada. And he said, which book do you like the best? And I said, the Bhagavad Gita, as it is. And he said, oh, very good. And as time went by, I went out of the room. And Srila Prabhupada said to Gargamuni Maharaj, after meeting me for the first time, he said, I will make that boy a sannyasi. I was 21 years old.
Well, the first time I met him was in his room at a lunch that Srila Prabhupada cooked. Now this time Srila Prabhupada was cooking for all of his new devotee disciples. There were the first 12 initiated disciples minus the one. Kirtanananda was not present at this time. But all the rest of them were. My sister Janki was the first female disciple. So Mukunda warned me, when you meet, we call him Swamiji then, when you meet Swamiji, you can say Hare Krishna, fold your hands like this. So I walked into Srila Prabhupada's quarters, and I remember him sitting in a shaft of light underneath a window. And he didn't have a shirt on. He was dishing out prasadam in this corner. So I said, Hare Krishna, Swamiji. And he said, what is your name? I said, Joan. And he said, so you're from your sister's family. When will the other family members come? I said, I'm the only one. No one else is coming. He said, oh. In India, generally there's a big preparation from the bride side of the family. Never mind. We will celebrate. So that day was my first lunch, and that was a very memorable lunch for a number of reasons. I was a macrobiotic aficionado at that time, and Srila Prabhupada's prasadam was all just power-packed with not only taste, but of course, because his hands had touched it, the way that he served the prasad to the devotees was like no meal I'd ever had. There was so much affection that manifested through Srila Prabhupada's distribution. Another side point, each one of the men ate up to 12 chapatis at a sitting. So that means Srila Prabhupada made a minimum of 144 chapatis for base to start, and then went on with whatever else they wanted to eat. So that was the very first time that I met Srila Prabhupada, that lunch.
My first real direct conversation with Prabhupada was when he was staying over on Formosa, because before the big temple on Watsika, he had separate quarters. Subsequently, he had separate quarters where he'd stay. And I got to go over there, and in fact, I remember it was when Neil Armstrong was in the moonshot, and I was there that day at Prabhupada's house. I had the good fortune of having prasadam. If memory serves me, the cook was Kartikeya, and Kartikeya told me he was making the hot chapatis, and he told me how Prabhupada really liked chapatis. Even though he was a small man, he could eat a dozen hot chapatis. And so I finally got to go into Prabhupada's room, and he looked directly at me and said a couple things, and then he said, in your opinion, or by your knowledge, what is God, or who is God? And having been brought up as a Catholic and, you know, greatness, I said, well, the greatest person. And he said, simply God, Krishna, is the person who there's no one equal to him or no one greater than him. And if you went everywhere throughout the universes, that would be your experience. So I left there with that understanding. I said, well, today I found out who really is God. It's the person who no one is greater than or no one is equal to. That was my first conversation with the Prabhupada.
So I went in there, and Prabhupada was sitting behind, you know, and he always had these coffee table type desks, and sitting there with one leg up, looked real serene, you know. And so I was real nervous, my hand was shaking, and I gave him the rose and laid down on the floor like the other devotees were doing, and I did my prayers in English, and I couldn't help myself from shaking from being in his presence. And then when we all sat up, there was like 12 new devotees, and Prabhupada said, so you're all very fortunate to come to Lord Chaitanya's movement, and now that you are fortunate, you should make others fortunate. Preach this message to Lord Chaitanya's all over the world. And he went on speaking for like 20 minutes, and he also said that if we served Vishnu, John, and Tamal nicely, that he would be happy. And so that's the first time I saw Prabhupada. And
for Mahaprabhu's appearance day, I wrote one poem on surrender to Lord Chaitanya. And I gave it to his servant to put on Srila Prabhupada's desk for Mahaprabhu's appearance day. But I didn't sign it. And Srila Prabhupada, I guess, had read it and liked it very, very much. And by process of elimination, he was asking everyone who had written this poem. And by process of elimination, it arrived to me. So he asked me, he called me into the room, and I was sitting with him there alone. And he was very, very sweet and very kind. And he said, so you have written a poem? And I said, yes, Srila Prabhupada. He said, oh, that's very good. To be poetic is one of the qualities of a Vaishnava. And he said, get a piece of paper and a pencil. And he had written to me a poem. Actually, it was prose, which he entitled 6 Verses on Surrender. And I wrote them down, one after another. And they were very much along the line of Rupa Goswami's teachings. And I still have them, which I have on our altar at home. And during that meeting with Srila Prabhupada, I had the opportunity to speak with him personally and alone. And I could reveal some of the things that were on my mind and in my heart. And I said to Srila Prabhupada, as I had mentioned earlier, that Krishna had revealed himself to me. and that's why I've come to you. And he said, now you must tell them that God is not dead. And then I said to Srila Prabhupada, Srila Prabhupada, you're the only person I trust in this world. And Srila Prabhupada looked up at me very kindly and he said, don't trust me. I will let you down. Trust Krishna. He will never let you down.
Well, actually, in those days, we were so inefficient at everything that we did, and so incapable of knowing the significance of what initiation meant. And I remember that, of course, at our fire yagya for the marriage, we didn't have enough money to buy butter, so we used margarine. And when Srila Prabhupada tried to start the fire, he picked up a piece of wood and he dipped it in. Beautiful. Prabhupada's hands were magnificent, long fingers. Like this, he picked it up and held it over the flame, and it went. He did it again. Over the fire, no action. So he looked up very grave and said, oh, this marriage will have a very slow start. I was mortified at that. I thought, uh-oh, what have I gotten into now? But, yeah, very significant. I suppose at initiation, I do remember very clearly that Srila Prabhupada first gave me the name Kalindi, which is another name of Jamuna. And very quickly, within 10, 12 seconds, he said, no, it is Jamuna Devi. And I said, what does that mean, Swamiji? And he said, the river that Krishna sports in Vrindavan is Jamuna. I always had an attraction to Vrindavan. And as early as 1967, I wanted to go to Vrindavan. So I remember one morning, we were on a morning walk with Srila Prabhupada. I believe that was around Stowe Lake. And I was walking right next to Srila Prabhupada. And he stopped. He put out his cane, leaning on his cane. And he said, so, we have received a letter from Achyutananda, and he wants some men to join his party in Lucknow. So I immediately popped up, said, I'd like to go, Srila Prabhupada. May we go? May Gurdas and I go? He said, yes, maybe we can arrange that. We will start an American house in Lucknow. Then we walked a little farther. Then he said, no, you should not go now. And he turned around and he said, someday I will take you to India on foot. I will show you India on foot. So from that moment I was waiting for that day that would come. And that came about 3 years later, 1970, October 4th. Our party of American and European devotees landed in Bombay, and our party had just a few days earlier arrived in Calcutta via Tokyo, some swamis. And in that fall between October 4th and Srila Prabhupada leaving India in the spring of 71, in so many places he showed us India on foot, literally walking on foot through the streets.
And devotees about doing the magazines, and I would do the books, and I'd invariably sell a few or several, and every night, especially Prabhupada would stay up very late, so sometimes we'd come back at 11:30 or something, and Gargan would say, Prabhupada wants to talk to you, and I'd run up, and he'd say, how many books did you sell, and how did it go, and who were the people, and what did you say to sell them? So that was interesting. In those days, later on in Sankirtan, people were wearing karmi clothes, or normal clothes, or wearing wigs and disguising it. In those days, we never thought about that, and I used to always tell the people exactly what I'd been hearing in the classes, that this was the Bible from India, and it would explain to you better about your past lives and goals. But Prabhupada, he was very specific. I mean, my recollections of Prabhupada, he was such a detailed person. Nothing escaped him. And if you just said something, and if it was lacking a little bit of substance, Prabhupada wanted to know what I was telling people. And he approved. I mean, I was listening in the classes in the morning, and I was saying things I was hearing, and he approved. But he wanted to know precisely what I was telling people and how it was that I was able to move those books and things like that.
The temple room was full of devotees, and one of the big book distributors asked Prabhupada, kind of a pointed question, Prabhupada, what pleases you the most? And Prabhupada said that if you develop your love for Krishna, that will please me the most. And all the devotees, the cooks, the pujaris, were Jai Prabhupada. So that was real nice to hear that.
Buddhimanta especially, rest his soul, was going out onto the streets, and of course he was a very imposing figure. He was very tall and big and bright-faced. He appeared somewhat crazed, I would say. But he was distributing incense, and he was begging for money, really, in a way that we had never done before. But he was collecting a lot of money to help bring this dream about. And I had some differences of opinion about how the money should be collected. Who was I? I mean, I was just really traveling through. But I made it known to some of the devotees that I thought maybe a monk shouldn't act like that. And it was really a bone of contention between Bali Mardana and myself at the time. Of course, we've reconciled that since then. But he called up Srila Prabhupada and he talked to Shyam Sundar and objected to my objecting to the way that they were collecting money. And Srila Prabhupada wrote a very instructive letter back. And he didn't criticize either of us. He didn't say, you're right and you're wrong. Either way, that wasn't his concern at all. He simply said, I just want that you should all be able to get along together. And I think that's very instructive, because we had different ideas about how devotional service should be carried out. And Prabhupada wasn't about to take sides. He rather wanted us to simply work together harmoniously. And it's something that's taken me a long time to understand. But I think that it tells something of his character, that he was more concerned about us working as a family than he was about crediting someone as being right or wrong.
The first San Francisco temple had certain similarities to the first New York temple, but then quite a few dissimilarities. The first being that in New York there were very few women. In San Francisco there was almost an equal balance of men and women. So already the chemistry of the temple was different. But in most places we were like Srila Prabhupada's children. I think the rasa of being children was foremost, although when one studies the letters of this period, we'll also find that sometimes Srila Prabhupada referred to us as his sons and daughters, and sometimes mothers and fathers. He let the role reverse for intimacy. But I think there isn't a devotee from these times, from the early days, who did not feel that every moment with Srila Prabhupada was intimate. Srila Prabhupada had such a way of showing a love and affection through distributing Krishna consciousness that immediately we felt he was the only object of. I'd never known what love was until I met Srila Prabhupada, and I think that was true for all of us. We learned to love each other through Srila Prabhupada, and we had very deep, wonderful, transcendental relationships between each other as God brothers and God sisters. And Srila Prabhupada was the father. That was the mood, at least in our San Francisco temple, and that was slightly different from New York. Because, again, there was a mix of the boys and girls. He called us boys and girls. And we were. Most of us were in our 20s. Between 25 and 30 was the average age of our San Francisco temple. I remember he was lecturing. Unfortunately, we do not have tapes from this period. Srila Prabhupada was recorded. I recorded with my little tape recorder. Gargamuni recorded when he came, and Hayagriva recorded. And out of all the recordings taken at this time, the only tapes that survived are the Krishna Lila tapes with Hayagriva, with Golden Avatar. So many of those have been lost. But he was lecturing on, not the TLC, but the Chaitanya Charitamrita. I remember after some very considerable amount of time, one of the devotees asked, "So, who is Lord Chaitanya?" And Prabhupada said, "Oh, such a nice, intelligent question. You are so intelligent for asking this question." And this is the subject matter of his lecture for several days. So he was so patient with us, whether we fell asleep or we cried, somehow or another we begin to hear, what is this Krishna consciousness? But most of us tasted our Krishna consciousness through chanting, dancing, and feasting. I think that's what we had senses for engaging in the most in those early days.
So Yasodhananda was reading to him. He asked him, Prabhupada, how is it that you wrote these books yourself? Why is it that you like to hear them again? You know what these books are. He said, I did not write these books. Krishna wrote these books. One day he was reading, I believe it was the Sri Upanishad, and Prabhupada asked him to read that last paragraph again. And he read it again. And Prabhupada said, these are not my words. They're changing my words. Write them immediately and tell them, do not change my words. He turned to Tamal and he said, is my English not good? And Tamal said, your English is perfect, Prabhupada. And he said, then why are they changing? He said, do not become like a leapfrog and try to jump over your spiritual master. This is the worst thing a disciple can do. Write them immediately and tell them, do not change my books. And he got very angry. It was the angriest I ever saw Prabhupada get. So it was very important that Prabhupada wanted only spelling errors, grammatical errors to be changed and nothing else. One time we carried Prabhupada, they were building the Gurukul in Vrindavan in 77, the last year there. And so we carried him in the rocking chair up to take a tour of it. And as we were going through the different areas, the devotee would say, this is my room, Prabhupada. Another one, this is my room, Prabhupada. And this is for this. Prabhupada got mad and he said, you're all so concerned about yourselves, your own rooms. I built this school for the kids. Fill it up. Fill it up with students. This is for the students. And he got upset about that. Then as we were carrying him back to his room, when we went by, we were carrying him in the chair, they were chanting in the temple room. They knew Prabhupada was going by. So they were, Jai Prabhupada, Jai Prabhupada. Prabhupada said, what are they chanting? And we said, they're chanting Jai Prabhupada. And he said, I do not like this. Tell them to chant Hare Krishna. So, I mean, it's okay a few times, but he didn't want it to go on and on and on and on. He never did that.
Later in one letter that I had received from Srila Prabhupada, I had informed him that I was going to get married. He gave me his blessings. And he said, but above all, continue to follow the 4 regulative principles and chant 16 rounds of Hare Krishna mantra every day. That will protect you. And he said, my only request is that you don't become an ordinary, common, foolish man. He wasn't concerned that one was a sannyasi or a grihasta. And he frankly said in the letter that these things, of course, even by Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, are considered external. But that he was concerned about, that we didn't become common, foolish men, but remained very high-minded and Vaishnavas.
Srila Prabhupada liked anything that was well prepared. He tried to teach us technique, procedure, quality, cleanliness, purity, in simple ways. He didn't teach with a lot of words, he taught by example. And of course, he had personal favorites. At this time, Srila Prabhupada was had a little tummy, and he was eating immense quantities of rice. Sometimes we would feed a very large thali, and he would finish off most of that thali, leave a little maha for us. But the things that he taught us were generally fatty and juicy and sweet and succulent and very sumptuous. That was the era of sumptuous prasad, because he felt if he could catch us through the tongue doing two things, vibrating and respecting, if he could capture us through those two ways, then we would begin to taste more and more Krishna consciousness. So the food was sumptuous and rich.
When he came to Rath Yatra, I took pleasure in cooking. I wanted to make something very nice, and his servant told me that he liked okra. And I was clued in on the secrets of preparing okra so it doesn't become too, that viscosity that comes with it, and how to dry it and cut it properly. And I remember there were a bunch of devotees, and we started cooking. Bhutatma was around then, and Krishnadas was there. And we made some very special preparations, and we made some, I remember I made this preparation with macadamia nut halva with cream, and I made some fancy rice and with gold leaf on it, the edible type, and all the devotees were saying, wow, we can't wait to get maha from this, and it came down empty. And it's, boy, Prabhupada really liked that. He ate everything. He really liked the okra, and every bit of it was gone. I felt like that was it. That was the apex of my life. That I cooked and it was good, that nothing came back down to be distributed. Yeah.
Another pastime in Hawaii is, Hawaii is very nice and tropical, so the devotees would bring Prabhupada a lot of fruits. Nice, lilikoi, passion fruit, but his favorite, of course, is the mango. And so there's like 40 varieties of mangoes in Hawaii. And so the devotee asked Prabhupada, Srila Prabhupada, what kind of mango do you prefer? We have so many kinds here. Which kind do you want me to bring you? And Prabhupada said, the ones from the eastern side of the tree. He didn't really care the brand, but the eastern side of the tree, because it gets the morning sun. He explained, and the morning sun gives the prana, and is the best fruit.
In Europe, I spent a lot of time initially preaching in Paris, and Srila Prabhupada was invited to come to Paris, and then we went on to Geneva, where we were starting a preaching program. And Guru Garanga had arranged for a hall to have some program. And I remember Bhagavan was there, and we were sitting on the stage after having had a kirtan with this very so-called sophisticated Swiss audience. And one person got up and asked the question, why are you vegetarians? And at that time, Srila Prabhupada's reply was, why don't you eat your sister? When I heard that, I looked at Bhagavan, and Bhagavan went like this. Like, oh no, how are we going to get out of this one? And then Prabhupada went on to explain, why can't you discriminate? And what he was saying, I think, was very extreme, of course. But what he was saying is that human life, and eating included, involves discrimination. And while he took an extreme position, it was very instructive, at least to the devotees, although some of the devotees didn't know how to take it at the time. But Srila Prabhupada could do that. He could sometimes be very shocking to make a point. And one thing is very sure, that we could never really predict how Srila Prabhupada was going to answer a question. And sometimes he would answer the same question differently because of the circumstances. And we'll never understand how or why, but we can appreciate Srila Prabhupada's character.
Krishna Krishna Hare